Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Dr. Bakari K. Lumumba of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we can gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black in conjunction with Bequaline Network, the Pan African social media extraordinaire. We have a great show for you all today where we're going to be interviewing the man, the myth, the legend, your favorite Black masculinist, and our Omega level Black man, none other than Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. If you're watching, make sure you like, subscribe, share, and donate. Look to have a great conversation with you all today. So without further ado, Dr. Johnson, how you doing today?
I'm better now, man. I'm glad we finally got this going. Y'all gotta excuse me, a lot of technical issues, but like I said, they're all Bakari's fault. So we good now.
Very good, very good. You know what? It's all good. As long as we're able to have a conversation, I'm okay with taking accountability. Um, so we're going to jump right into the conversation. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. But before we get started, because we have a live audience, I want to just kind of go over some ground rules that we have here at Lumumba Speaks and Bequaline Network. One, diversity of thought is welcome. We believe how do you grow not only as a person but as an intellectual by having diversity of thought. So irrespective if you're on the left, you're on the right, or you're right down the middle, this is a place where you can be part of the conversation. Number two, no racial epithets, no epithets of any kind. We believe that this is a space of Black empowerment. We believe in the three N's of Black power: self-respect, self-defense, and of course, self-determination. So no epithets of any kind are allowed. Number three, if we have a conversation, facts over feelings, right? So we want you to attack the argument, not the person, no ad hominems. And then last but not least, no fundamentally false statements, right? You can have an opinion, but no fundamentally false statements. As many of you all know, I am Dr. Bakari K. Lumumba. I am a scholar, so I am responsible for the information that, of course, is disseminated on my platform. So if you make a statement that you believe, that we use this as a colorful example, that LeBron James is the best basketball player ever, no problem. If you say he's the best basketball player ever because he won 6 scoring titles, that is a fundamentally false statement. I'm going to act like I'm Mr. Sandman at the Apollo. And last but not least, our mission here at Lumumba Speaks and Bequaline Network is neither to exonerate or vilify, but to challenge conventional wisdom and re-examine what has previously been accepted as fact. So with that being said, Dr. Johnson, how are you doing today?
Oh man, crazy week. It's just one of those time periods, but everything's good, man. Nothing to complain about. How about
No
yourself?
doubt, no doubt. I'm doing quite all right. I can't complain. Just got a fresh tattoo yesterday, so I'm still making it happen.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, little leg sleeve. So we're going to jump right in. First question, of course, you are aware. How did you, and of course, you're known for your work in Black male studies. Your book, Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Black Blackness, and Black Male Death, the Black Masculinist Turn, I would argue, is canonical text in the field of Black male studies. How did you become a Black male studies scholar?
Well, goodness, it's an interesting little history, but it's one of those things where I just kind of was moving in a certain direction, whether I was clear about it or not. Because throughout grad school, my focus was not specifically on Black men. That actually happened after I left grad school and I started teaching. And it was about a year or so in, I realized that my research interests, which were kind of tied more to hip hop, really, it wasn't about hip hop. It really was more about Black men. And subconsciously, hip hop was the vehicle that I was using to study Black men. But I kind of shifted and focused more on it. The more experiences I had at Fresno State, some of the things I saw with young brothers that were going on, things that I wanted to deal with. I set up organizations. I created a class for Black males. And then, after a few years, I just I got tired of just focusing on the students in my classroom because the conversation would only go so far. Like I would, I get a semester, I get a new bunch of kids. We get to a certain point and the conversation would be getting good and the semester would end. And then the next semester, I'd have to start all over again. And I didn't feel like I was really able to progress that way. So I created a blog. And it's a blog I still use to this day, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. That's where you can find the Black male political agenda and a whole bunch of other articles and things that I've written over the years. But I started that blog kind of like to plant my flag to say, okay, I'm here. I'm doing this work on Black men, and I'm not going to do it the way I've seen these other brothers do it who are mostly feminists. Because what we were taught was the only way you could advocate for Black men is to, advocate for Black women, which on the surface sounds great. But what we didn't know is advocating for Black women was synonymous with Black feminism. And so it ended up being this kind of contradictory idea where supporting these misandrous feminists was how you were supposed to advocate for Black men. And I decided to kind of dislodge that idea and really just dive into what Black males had to say. You could see it in my class. Like the first couple of years I taught the class, it was really about, what I learned about gender was always about being critical of Black men and pedestalizing Black women. So what I noticed the first couple of years is I had more and more and more Black female students and fewer and fewer and fewer Black male students. And then it hit me that the girls were taking my class so that they could use me to finger wag at the Black males about things they didn't like, from dating to, whatever it may be. And then the books we were using, and this is a trip, I'm kind of working on this now in my upcoming book, but I might make mention of it. Most of the books that I could find that were dealing with Black men were, again, written by Black men who were, supporting feminism, thinking that was the idea, which really comes out of a Black nationalist context, they advocate for the women and the men. That's community, right? There's nothing wrong with that, except
typically there's a duality there, but we're really not seeing that typically when you talk about coming out of the academy.
Well, because there was a bit of a sleight of hand, and I think feminists were integral to that, because feminists kind of shifted that and said, well, to advocate for Black women, you got to really be talking about feminism, and so most men were just like, okay, we kind of went with it, and it caused all kind of problems. But what I started to do is the books I know what I was saying was the books I noticed we were using were mostly written by feminists like Mark Anthony Neal, or Athena Mutwa. And even though I like Mutwa's work, she was willing to be critical of Black feminism to an extent. Neal never. I mean, Neal is one of those, Black feminists that just whatever Black feminists say, you roll with. And I noticed the books were even a problem. So I had to move away from the how I was traditionally taught and from the books. And what I started to do is foreground the Black males in the class. And I started giving them the floor and letting them speak from their experiences. And then what I noticed over the next couple of years after that is the number of Black males in the class went up, the number of Black females in the class went down, and we started to finally get to what Black men were interested in, in that way. So it was, just watching I could write a book just about what happened in the class, not even the material of the class, just what happened in regard to the class. So as I started doing that, I started using the blog. I ran into Tommy Curry, and Tommy Curry, I think was, he was doing his scholarship. This was before the Man Not by a few years. And we started to collaborate. There was a small collective, maybe 5 to 7 of us. And we were just constantly in dialogue. And, Tommy and I were both working on books at the same time. And we just kept rolling. And the next thing we knew, we were having conversations about Black male studies led by Tommy in that respect. And we just went from there. So it really was a lot of, it was nothing I could say I just created. I didn't wake up one day and say, oh, I'm a Black male scholar, let's go make this thing happen. It just kind of rolled, and each opportunity opened out of the last. And next thing I know, here we are. But yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
Very good. What is Black male studies? For those who don't know, people may be familiar with your work, but may not have a working or textbook definition of what Black male studies is.
Well, most of it, including Black feminist studies, comes out of Africana studies, which was initially Black studies, right? So Black studies was the initial platform. And just to let you know, there's a lot of them, and this from experience. There's a lot of different subfields that came out of Black male studies. Black studies. So hip hop studies, gang studies, Black women's studies, Black LGBT studies, Black queer studies. There's so many subfields that came out of it. It's ridiculous. But what we've started to see in Black studies over the last, I'd say, a couple decades, is the field has really been hijacked. I use the word colonized in a strange kind of way by these Black feminists, because many of them were subsidized by white leftists and white feminists in that respect. So Black studies at this point, especially if you go like to the National Council for Black Studies conference, there's some good people there, don't get me wrong, but you can see the ways Black feminism has kind of absorbed much of the conversation, and that also applies to the job positions, so on and so forth. If you go up for a job, that applies to the people sitting on the committee, and they're filtering it out to make sure that more and more Black feminists come on board. And so you kind of seeing this kind of colonization of the field taking place from this, this ideology, which initially comes out of really white feminism. But that's kind of what's happening. But Black male studies, going back to your question, is something we started a few years ago because even though it's not directly tied to the encroaching expansion of Black female studies, what we started to notice was that the conversation on Black males was superficial at best. So Black women were going deeper and deeper, depending on how you define deep, but they were talking about everything from Black women drumming to, mortality rates and birth and, all these issues and, history of Black women and slavery and all of that breadth is fine. But what we noticed is when it came to Black men, we were either talking about incarceration, drugs and drug use and drug sales or violence. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Black on Black
IPV,
violence.
yeah.
Yeah, there were only a couple of acceptable topics that you could cover on Black men. And I went to a conference probably about a decade ago now, and I remember a woman got up and she gave a presentation on Black males, and her argument was, as a framework of analysis, all you needed to study Black males was to use the movie. What's the John Singleton movie? His first big break. Boys in the Hood. She said that's all you need to study. So this is probably 2015, right? She gets up and gives a presentation and basically says, you don't need to use any model past early 1990s. You just use Boys in the Hood to study Black men. Now, she meant well, but what I don't think she was clear about was that Black women were, using all of these different dynamics to study anything and everything possible about Black female life. But the idea was there's nothing new to say about Black men. We're all figured out. As long as you talk about incarceration, drugs, and violence, Black men are figured out. And so I think that's where a lot of the impetus behind Black male studies came from. It was like, well, that's what other folks are telling us, even in the Black community. That's what they're telling us is what it means to study Black men. And then, of course, they had this argument, well, Black studies has been, sexist against women. So really, Black male studies already existed because all these men in the academy, it's really an argument they transplanted straight from white feminism and applied it to Black men, even though we don't have the same relationship white men and white women do. But they applied it nonetheless, and they made the argument that all that Black male stuff has already been done. But when you actually look at a lot of the data, it actually hadn't been done. So when we started looking at everything from intimate partner violence, intimate partner homicide, suicide rates, there's so many different sub areas. Matter of fact, here I'll.
And then what you're speaking to is a 1982 book. The title of that book was "All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave." So that really sets the stage for the argument from a Black feminist perspective that Black studies in itself was merely a study of Black males, which that wasn't the case. One can maybe argue that the historiography of Black history was androcentric, right? But you couldn't make the argument that the study of Black people was androcentric. So,
well, and you also have to keep in mind that that was the nature of how the academy functioned. That wasn't something Black men created, but there was always a legacy of Black men acknowledging Black women, but not to the scale of what feminists demanded. But I put this in the about section of my blog. I listed out some of the areas of study in Black male studies, and I talked about carceral treatment, criminal and civil sentencing, leading causes of death, health, employment, income, wealth status, education, violence, intimate partner violence and homicide, rape, housing and homelessness, labor, political ideology, wealth, family court impact, fatherhood, forms of protest, marriage, and institutionally based treatment, and not to mention anti-Black misandry. Now that even though that was something I wrote at the onset of what we were doing, before we had even had any serious number of publications yet in Black male studies, I was saying this is more the breadth of what it should be, and not just conversations about prison. You know what I mean?
Right.
So those are the conversations that we were having, and that's where Black male studies kind of came out of, this need to push beyond stereotypes and talk about Black men empirically. And that's one of the things
Right.
that we wanted to do, that we think, we thought that feminist, scholarship really kind of lacked at different stages, was this emphasis on what is empirically manageable, measurable, as opposed to just, saying Black men are great. So what we do in Black male studies, it's not about suggesting that Black men are always good or innocent, because that's not the nature of human beings. We look at what is measurable, what can we understand, and what can we find out are the reasons for whatever phenomenon we're identifying. And we think that that's far more productive to understand Black men, rather than either valorizing or contradicting stereotypes as the sole way to go. I mean, it's linear. And we decided to kind of go that way. And Tommy had a lot to do with the push for the empirical, So yeah, so that's where we started.
So let me ask you this, because I've been in conversation, and I've shared this with you offline, with a number of Black feminists, particularly those in the academy. The argument they make is that Black male studies is nothing more than intellectual misogynoir. Mm-hmm. Why do Black feminists make this argument, in your opinion?
I think fundamentally, what I've noticed in the academy is that if you're critical of women or feminists, either really, and not critical in the sense that you are, dehumanizing or dismissing the experiences, but critical in the sense that you're not, valorizing them, you're not pedestalizing them. That alone seems to be synonymous with misogyny. I mean, the reality is, the way I've seen misogyny thrown around, it really comes down to whatever you do that I haven't approved of. That's what I seem to notice it is. So if you point out, even something as surface level as, boys are being ignored. If we talk about, say, graduation rates from K through 12, and we look at the last 40 years of graduation, we're seeing that boys across race are falling behind. And there's been such an emphasis on improving the state of girls that I would argue that boys are suffering because they've been wholly dismissed with this idea that because of patriarchy, they don't need anything. But nobody problematized the definition of patriarchy or questioned who the hell patriarchy actually applied to. It was just something society pushed. So when you say, hey, we're ignoring the boys, the first response is often, well, that's misogynistic. So even the emphasis on boys and men is considered misogynistic, depending on who you're talking to. But I've routinely heard this from Black feminists, that emphasis alone. So like when Obama was pushing for the My Brother's Keeper program, not only did feminists call it misogynistic, they organized a national petition to either add girls or dismiss it. Yeah. Even though there was already a White House Council for Women and Girls, and nobody said anything about the fact that there was no White House Council for Men and Boys. Because if there was, then the fight would have been different. It would have been, okay, how do we get some of this, energy toward Black males? But there wasn't even a council for that. But women had that kind of council, and Black women took one look at it, took one look at the My Brother's Keeper program, and attacked the program for not including girls. But there was no question about the empirical reasons why they were emphasizing boys, because boys had fallen behind to such a degree. That was dismissed. And it was dismissed as misogynistic just on the surface. So, yeah, I think a lot of it is a competition for resources. A lot of it is a hostility about and a misunderstanding of any emphasis on boys and men somehow being an attack on women and girls. And those two need not be synonymous.
Correct. What is anti-Black misandry?
Anti-Black misandry is the hatred of Black males, and Black males can be addressed across age, across class, across geography, across occupation. It's simply a hatred of Black males, and that can manifest socially. It can manifest institutionally. There's so many different levels. And the funny thing about it is, when we started talking about misandry, first thing we heard from feminists was that, well, you guys are just trying to copy misogyny. There's really nothing there. But the interesting thing is, whenever I ran into Black scholars, Black male scholars, and I mentioned the concept. One brother, I'll give you an example. I saw a brother of mine at a conference. He was a professor out at Long Beach. And I pulled him aside. I said, "Hey man, I just want to say a word, a concept to you, and I'm not going to define it. I'm just going to give you the concept, and I want to know what your reaction is." He said, "All right." I said, "Anti-black misandry," and his face went, "Oh, shit!" Like he had a whole visceral response, and all it took was having the concept introduced. And he said, "Okay, well, that hits me in so many different ways. What would you say is a quick example of anti-black misandry?" I said, "Okay, lynching." And he dropped on the floor. He was like, "Holy," because when you think about lynching, the way it's discussed in a lot of Black studies programs, for example, is that lynching is something that happened to Black people. And there are women who have been lynched. There are Black women who've been lynched. Right. There are white men who've been lynched. So let's be clear. Lynching in and of itself was not solely something that happened to Black males, but in the majority, you know what I mean? In the majority, yes, it was targeted toward Black males.
Targeted towards Black males, yes.
And the targeting was because you were both Black and male. It didn't even matter if you were gay or not, because that couldn't be verified. They might not have even considered that. Sexuality was not a factor. It was simply a question of gender and race. So when you look at it along those lines, you have a practice that was approved by the state, as it were, because there would often be governors and sheriffs and whatnot that would attend lynchings and participate as if it was some kind of family event, as it was for many white folk, right?
Yeah.
But
many people may be unaware that at one point in our society, there were morning and evening newspapers. And oftentimes there would be articles in the morning newspaper telling people that there will be a lynching in the evening.
Right. Yeah. And they would take postcard pictures. W.B. Du Bois talks about being in Atlanta and walking by a butcher shop and seeing the remains of a lynched Black man on display in the butcher shop. So this was not only endorsed by the police, by the elected representatives, it was endorsed socially amongst the white population, to where it was considered a family event, and the outcome of it could be put on display for the public to enjoy. But who was the target of this? Overwhelmingly in number, Black males. So when I talk about institutional anti-Black misandry, to me, that's an example of that. They weren't targeting anyone else. Now, there were others who were killed in that fashion, but they weren't targeted in that fashion.
Right. So here's a question from Summer. She says, "How do you feel about the single mom by choice thing going on? And how does it affect Black men in general? Meaning, does it negatively affect Black men's image surrounding fatherhood and marriage? There are a few Black male sperm donors."
Well, yeah, I think, first of all, really a lot of the behavior that we're seeing in this so-called gender war and whatnot, to me, has been really pushed and socialized, sanctioned through policy. It's been socialized through policy. Policy actually does change behavior, especially over long periods of time. And the contempt for Black fathers is a product of policy. I do believe it starts when you talk about the welfare era. You're talking, people say, "Well, what does welfare have to do?" We know institutionally the major push was that in order for you to have access to it, much of the time the father could, not only did he have to be out the house, in some states he had to be out of the state in order for you to have those resources. So here you're seeing a practice where grandmothers, mothers, daughters, and granddaughters are starting their households, and in each context seeing a woman running the household without the presence of a man. And it didn't take long before some women became somewhat predatory about that. Like we've seen, especially since the era of social media, women have been very honest. And I've seen women say, "Well, why would I have 4 children for one man and get 1 child support check when I can get 4 children from 4 different men and get 4 child support checks?" It became structured in such manner where women could operate in a predatory fashion using the family court, right, and social services to operate on their behalf. And men found themselves on the exploited end of the dynamic, often pushed out of families, even though we know Black men are the most participatory men in terms of fatherhood and families out of every racial group. We still have seen women able to use institutions to push black men out, maintain decision-making status in the family.
Yeah.
They can even determine who's in the family and who isn't.
Correct.
There's a lot of
Very,
grown
very true.
children that have had to go find their fathers to get the story of why he wasn't there. And let's not even talk about how many fathers find themselves vilified and nobody even hearing what happened to them from their side of the story.
Right.
And by the time you even get to, it's alienation, and you have to fight. And I don't got to tell you about this. You already know. You know, you have to fight upstream. You got to talk to grown offspring and try to contradict 20-something odd years of programming from their mothers. And I'm not saying that this is some demonic thing that women have created from scratch. It doesn't have to be that for it to be as impactful as it is. All it is it's a set of options that have been made available to them that was incentivized by material resources that they were able to benefit from at the expense of men. And in a fashion, all it took was a little bit of a drive to exploit for profit. And you add about 50 years to that, and this is where we are.
Yeah.
So
I would argue, about 20, 30 years, well, about 30, 40 years ago, CBS ran a documentary in the late 80s, mid 80s, The Vanishing Black Family.
Yes.
And they saw in one generation, people were like, women, in fact, young Black women. I grew up without my father, and I turned out just fine. So my kid doesn't need a dad.
Yes, but we can look at society and raise that question. No,
Absolutely.
you're right. Yeah,
so let me ask you this.
But just to say, and to her question, the whole single mother movement by choice or whatnot is a product of that history. The enmity toward Black fatherhood, the attack on Black men, the extent to the focus on securing his resources while expelling him from any decision-making capacity, all of that is a product of over a half century of policy and programming that operated against his interests. And now it's coming to a head.
Absolutely. So appreciate the super chat. Question: was the 1974 movie Claudine accurate or prophetic?
I think you got a little bit of both in there. And I think they were trying to call attention to where this would go, or what some refer to as the tangle of pathology coming out that was arguing, before that this is where this would go. And for the most part, people just kind of dismissed it and kept going, but it was almost an inevitable response. And if you look around the world, you'll find very few instances where you set the genders against each other by underdeveloping the men and advancing the women. You want to talk about destabilizing a community? Because even to this day, I use this example when I'm talking to people. If you want to date a woman and she's on public aid, in order for you to match value with what she has in her home, you actually have to make the amount of money that comes with that. So you don't get a break on your rent or your mortgage. You don't get a break on utilities. You don't get a break on internet. You don't get a break on groceries. You have to make that. And BGS Ibmore and I a few years ago calculated it out to about $60,000 in terms of resources that a woman might get from public aid that you actually have to make in hard cash to match value. But in the dating world, a woman will tell you, if you don't have what I have at the least, you wasting my time. But you're talking about average men who have to go out and make what she gets, because the practice of the man in the house rule in terms of downplaying men's attempts to receive public aid, that's still there. It's still in practice, even though the policy has been dismissed. So you have a lot of men that can't turn to the state. They have no safety net to fall into, and whatever they have to make, from cold cash, whereas women don't have to necessarily work that way. And that is splitting up dating and mating and family formation, and has been for the last half century in the Black community.
We got a question from Snapshot Reviews. Shout out to SSR from Jolly Old London. So he's in the UK right now. Appreciate you tapping in, brother. The question is, I've seen many examples of Black men's really hold back and I presume you're saying Black women really hold back the development of their sons and be really dismissive of any input or pushback the sons might give. Would you describe that as misandry?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a social practice that we've seen. I mean, essentially, you can talk about Black women having a culture of their own in the Black community. right? There's a culture for Black women, there's a culture for Black men within the community. But when we look at the changes in Black women's culture in the last century, a lot of it again has been reinforced and influenced by policy and resources that come from outside of the Black community, right? And that has changed attitudes and perspectives. So, what was the question that you just had on the screen? What was it? What was? Oh, about sons. That was right. So,
Yes.
the question about being dismissive of sons. Well, if you see males as a threat and as a problem, of course that's going to be where that goes, right? Whether it's a father who his presence can disrupt the family's financial security, from the state, or if it comes down to a teenage son who reaches the age of 16, gets in trouble with the law, and his mother might be pushed out of the housing she got because of that. Boys and
Right.
men can easily be perceived as a threat, right, to a security system or economic security system that's in place that primarily benefits women and girls. So it doesn't take long to see how men can become a threat to that. And of course, the whole idea of turning to men for security is heavily under question and has been historically for many in the Black community. So it's not surprising when you see a kind of enmity developing toward Black men who are perceived as not being able to support families the way white men can. And by the time Black women are working with white women, going back to, well, we could talk about it if we just go post-slavery, and you talk about Black women working domestic work, right, in white women's houses. Who does she compare you to when she comes home from this white man's house every day? She's looking at this white woman. She's looking at this white man. I had that situation myself. My wife worked with the major gifts office at Scripps College. These were old white women at an all-women's college. So I'm a graduate student. We're living in a one-bedroom cottage on campus. I'm working 4 jobs and working on my doctorate, and she's working around rich white women in their 50s through their 70s, wearing perfumes that we've never heard of before, jewelry we've never seen before, driving cars that we barely have ever heard about, taking trips to places we've never heard about. That's what she's seeing every day, to come home to a graduate student living in a cottage, trying to get a degree. That has an effect over time. And if it's not from directly working with them, you're watching, what do they call that? Soap operas, on TV every day, and you're seeing how these white women are represented on screen. And the fundamental idea, really going back to slavery, is the white man is providing a stable, almost fantastical, ideal life for white women. And these niggas over here just can't get it together enough to take care of you right. But the
Right.
definition of right is established by looking at, these elite white families. And a lot of the time, there's a lot of, mental gymnastics going on, because there are far more poor white folk than there have ever been wealthy white folk. And you never hear that comparison being made. Black men are often compared to elite white men in the minds of too many Black women who are looking at the difference and suggesting that somehow the problem is Black men. And so you get a lot
Correct.
of that tension developing out of those dynamics from media and direct contact with white women. Those are the kind of comparisons that Black men have to grapple with.
So in your book, Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Flat Blackness and Black Male Death, the Black Masculine Son, you discuss several forms of anti-Black misandry, one of which is heterophobia. What is anti-Black misandric heterophobia?
Well, I actually had and you see it in the book, there are quite a few different forms of misandry, and I kind of list out some of those different kinds. But phobia is just a fear of straight Black men. And again, and I can use the same example I used before, because the first time, whenever I say it, I always get someone that says, that doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody be afraid of straight men? And I'll tell you, well, again, let's go back to lynching. Even though I would say, they never really mentioned the difference between gay and straight. But if the fundamental idea behind lynching Black men was that they were accused of raping white women, then what kind of men are we talking about? We're not talking about
Exactly.
trans men. We're not talking about gay men. We're clearly talking about straight men. Well, that is a fear and a hatred, right, for straight black men. The lynching of men, and we have to remember the overwhelming, rationale for lynching was the rape of white women. So that is a direct
Correct.
connection to heterosexual black men. And obviously, when you start talking about crime post 50s, 1960s, crime, criminality, and rape go together hand in hand as far as the public perception of why black men were dangerous. But again, that reinforces the idea that it's not just black men, it's straight black men that are the problem, and that should be feared, locked up, or killed to suit the public interest. So that's what that black heterophobia speaks to. It's very direct and very targeted, and it actually does have an impact on LGBT in an inverse kind of way. Because I talk about this too. And when you think about, you remember a few years ago when they were having the whole issue with bathrooms and which bathrooms different people should be able to use, and
Correct.
where should trans people go for the bathrooms. At what point did you hear people having a lot of conversation about trans men using male bathrooms? Did you hear any?
None whatsoever.
No. Nobody was afraid of where trans men were using bathrooms. They were afraid of where trans women were using bathrooms. Well, what was the fear
Right.
there? The fear was that these biological men were going to sexually assault women in women's bathrooms. Well,
Correct.
even though we're talking about trans, you're still talking about a form of heterophobia, because you're really identifying the heterosexuality of a biological male as a threat. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We can get into the weeds on the debate of that. But the issue is the fear of straight black men and straight men, period, play into this on a variety of levels that a lot of people don't even think about. Because if it was just a matter of trans folk using bathrooms, we would have heard just as much energy about trans men, trying to use stalls in the black and male bathrooms. But we heard none of that. Right.
Right.
So nobody was worried that trans men were going to molest little boys in bathrooms. Didn't hear about it. But we know that women will molest. I mean, shit, it's a damn near epidemic at this point. How many teachers you see who are sexually violating, male students? But did anybody worry that trans men were going to violate underage male students in bathrooms? Absolutely not. Right. So that speaks to some type of ideology at work, not just a fear of what actually happens every day. It's an ideology guiding this. And in that context, it's a fear of male heterosexuality, most particularly directed at black men.
Absolutely. You also mentioned something I think is rather prevalent, particularly in the podcast and social media space today. And that is coarse and refined anti-black misandry. What is coarse and refined anti-black misandry? Because you talk about it comes off as objective, right? Because it's espoused by individuals who are credentialed, judges, lawyers, politicians, etc. But what we really find is they're espousing just a what?
Well, I'm going to I'm bringing you into this. I'm bringing you into this because you're a scholar as well as an administrator. Every answer I can give, you've had the same kind of experiences. You've been on 100 different campuses. You know what this. You've been a student, a grad student, an administrator, and an academic. So let's talk about coarse and refined, misandry. So that being said, we know the course is brazen. The course is unrefined. It's unrefined. It's gritty. It's like when you go on to Twitter, or what was Twitter. Shout out International Quiet Storm. And remember when they were calling black men bullet bags? Well,
yes, I am familiar with that. I was in graduate school.
Yeah, that's an example of coarse, anti-black misandry. It's just it's coarse. It's not very well developed. It's just. And it really goes along with what we used to hear in the 70s and the 80s. Niggas ain't shit, right? That's coarse misandry. But let's talk about refined. Let's talk about the academics. Let's talk about the white collar, well-educated forms of misandry. And I want to ask you if you can pull an example from your experience on these campuses or in any other setting, because we've seen it in courtrooms. You know what I mean? We've seen it in professional settings. What would you give as an example of refined anti-black misandry from your own experience?
I would argue my own experience is the pathologizing of black maleness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so a good example would be, and I would give this example because I've talked about this with you before,
Mm-hmm.
when I was focusing on my PhD at the Ohio State University. We're in
Okay.
a class, and the class was about student activism and higher education.
Okay.
We're reading a book for the course, and I disagreed with something in the book that
Right.
stated that only women suffered emotional labor in the workplace. I said,
Right.
I disagree. I think anyone can experience emotional labor in the workplace based on the demographics of the workplace. If you're
Right.
an immigrant and working with American born, if you're queer working with heterosexual, if you're male working with predominantly female, you're going to experience emotional labor. Young
Mm-hmm.
lady who was around my age, she was actually ahead of me in the program. PhD student says, "You're just disagreeing because it's about women." I said,
Wow.
"No, I stated why I disagree with that the fact that it only pertained to women." I said, "This is just patently false."
Mm.
The professor jumps in and says, "Black women suffer violence at the hands of black men." This has nothing to do with the conversation in class. So I
Right.
responded back and said, "Well, no, domestic violence is bi-directional. In
There
fact, I
you
use the
go.
term intimate partner violence. And, I'm trying to be
Mhm.
all intellectual. So intimate partner violence is bi-directional nowadays. You can even check, crime statistics.
Right.
The professor's response then was, "You're trying to control the conversation with your masculinity." I
Wow.
said, "That Jedi mind trick won't work on me." I said,
Mm-hmm.
"You have stereotyped a demographic group that I'm part of as inherently violent and criminal in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't expect me to take umbrage with that?" I said, "A reasonable person would take umbrage with you doing that about a demographic group that they're part of." Now, mind you,
Yeah.
this is at an elite institution, a
Yes.
research one institution, at a
Yes.
top 5 program in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And this is being articulated by a tenured
Yes.
professor who is
Yes.
well read, well
Yes.
studied, has published book articles, published books. This is how prevalent it is.
Yes. When
I give you
when
another
you're
example.
okay.
At the same institution, my first month in the program, we have a meeting between the first and second year cohorts about issues regarding gender. I, of course, was oblivious to what was going on because, I at the time was engaged. So my job was to go to work, go to school, come home to my fiance and our small child. White girl, well, they said she was Latino, but she passed as white. States, well, one of the issues that I have, she said two things, is, "Bakari, you're very masculine, and it makes me feel uncomfortable."
Mm.
I said, "Okay, what you want me to do here?" One of the professors, I'm not going to say her name, white woman, feminist, says, "Well, Bakari, what I think you should do is when you walk into a room, you should change who you are to make
Yeah.
people comfortable with your
Yeah.
appearance, with your
Yeah.
presence." And I
Yeah.
said, "You know what, I said, Dr. X, I can't agree with that." And I'll tell you why. I said, one, I wouldn't advise my children to do that. I said, two, if I did that, I wouldn't have an identity. I would be a chameleon.
Yeah.
And I said, three, here's the biggest issue. What you're asking me to do is a violation of Clause 7 of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that takes place in academia. And this wasn't some run-of-the-mill for-profit institution. This is a elite research one,
Right.
institution that has a global brand.
Yes.
These are some of the best professors in the country in their field, and this is how I'm being treated and talked to.
No, I look. I'll give you an example, and I know people in the listening audience is a lot of the brothers have probably had this experience as well. If you are what's considered physically imposing, see, I'm 6'2", over 300 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
You're incredibly physically fit. If you see Bakari, he looks like a bodybuilder, right? But in as much as other people might find that interesting, like big men, strong, whatever, you'll find people who are highly intimidated by that, right?
Yeah.
And so you're at work and you find people who are incredibly afraid. I've had repairmen who come to my classroom to fix the system, the projector or whatever. And when I looked upset about something, it even had nothing to do with them. I just looked upset because I was thinking about something. One guy was like, "Well, please don't hit me." And he said this in front of 40 odd students. And I'm going,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a bill I got to pay tomorrow. I'm not thinking about hitting you.
My previous employer, my first day on the job, I'm being introduced around campus. I have on wingtips, slacks, and a polo shirt.
Exactly.
And they introduced me to people. One of the guys says, "Hey man, don't beat me up."
Yes, but I wasn't done. I'm not done, but I'm trying to get to where this really hits you in terms of refined anti-Black misandry, right? So you have a fear of that. I've gotten into elevators with female deans, and they'll hide in the corner and hold their bag. It's just an instinct. They're looking at me, they're holding their bag, and I'm like, yeah, I did 20 odd years of higher education so that I can get a doctorate, get tenure, and rob you of your purse at 2:00 on a work day, so I can lose all of that and go to jail. That's why I did all of that extra schooling. But my point, really what I was going to bring up, is if you found yourself in a situation where people become afraid of you, and all of a sudden you start getting work reviews that lower, that give you low grades in terms of how your work is being done, and then all of a sudden you're invited to leave because you've had several months of bad reviews. These kinds of things are what I would call an example of a refined, anti-Black misandry, right? Where it's not, nobody calls you out of your name, nobody screams, but you can tell that in response to how intimidated others are, they use, the politics of the office to get rid of you. So you start getting these negative work reviews, you start getting written up over trivial things that others are doing, like, you're eating, you're drinking, and off your break. Little minor infractions all of a sudden start to stack up, and you find yourself the only one being, told to leave. Now, it's difficult to prove in court without the proper evidence, but I'm saying if that is happening because people are intimidated, as by you simply being a Black man in that space, and I've seen this come from white folk, and I've seen it come from Black men. I mean, excuse me, not Black men. I've seen it come from Black women. All right, but the point is, it's still anti-Black misandry, and yes, Black men can participate in that. All you gotta do is go listen to Funky Deniva, and you can hear how Black men can participate in anti-Black misandry. But no matter who it comes from, if it's targeted at you because you are Black and male, and they use something like strategic and abstract, like work reviews, to get rid of you over a period of time, that would be, to me, an example of a refined anti-Black misandry. It's very smooth. Nobody called you out your name. You know what I mean? It can just happen in that kind of fashion. That would be an example. But I've also seen. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, one last example, and I snapshot. I see your comment. During that meeting, young lady says to me, I feel uncomfortable because you speak with a lot of confidence.
Yeah.
And I said, so what you want me to do? Talk like I don't believe the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Yeah.
Right. So these are some of the things, right? And if I was a lesser man, I didn't have a high level of self-confidence and really assured of who I am and the way I present in the world, I probably could have failed for those type of tricks. Right.
Yeah.
And sought to demasculinize myself.
Shout out to Cauliflower. I appreciate that statement. But what I would say is there was another example that I was just about to say a moment ago. Damn it. I've seen Black feminist scholars get up and give questionable statistics that reinforce stereotypes about Black men. Right. So, for example, if you take the concept of grape, the FBI definition of grape had not changed from the beginning of the 20th century till 2012. And it basically involved the penetration of a female body. So if that's the technical definition of grape, then what percentage of those are gonna highlight men who've experienced grape? Well, if the definition is the violation and penetration of a female body, you're not going to get any virtually. So I've seen Black women on television, academics, right, articulating arguments about how 99% of rapes in the Black community are committed by men. Now, this is a problematic idea because the very definition excludes Black men. when they
Yeah.
finally revised the definition post 2012, now you had all of these different cases that didn't have a formal classification now coming in, and they're starting to find that what men experience, and boys for that matter, was on par with girls. There was even a time.com article that said the rates are virtually synonymous with one another, but the whole area of what men experience was dismissed for over a century or near a century because it didn't fit the formal definition of how grape was used. So when you have a Black woman scholar who will get up and say something like 99% of rapes are committed by Black men in the Black community, not only does it reinforce stereotypes, it gives the impression of this coming from a qualified, well-studied, white-collared scholar. But this is an example of a refined anti-Black misandry, right? It appears true. It appears scholarly, and empirical. It's a professional who's giving this on a television show or a documentary, but a little bit of common sense would suggest that really makes no sense, But
Absolutely.
Again, that's a refined anti-Black misandry.
Absolutely. Why did you develop the Black male agenda?
The Black male political agenda came about in 2020 because we were having conversations, obviously, about politics. COVID was going on. The whole question about the next president, what was going on, all of those questions were there. There was a lot of intensity around it. And so we started to think about what kind of policies Black men need. But to be clear, I didn't author it in the traditional sense. I really just used my resources as a way to archive what Black men were talking about. So I invited the listeners of my show, The Onyx Report, to give ideas about what policies would make their lives easier or better. Will improve the quality of life for Black males across across age and across class. So it was focused on Black men and Black boys. And I said, what policies would help? It's gotten up to 19 points, and many of the 19 points have a series of subpoints, but they were written by everyday Black men giving ideas based on their own direct experiences. And I just kind of archived it. I've left it as a living document that anybody can contribute to, as long as the idea can measurably be proved to improve the quality of life for Black men and boys. And that's really the only measure. And I just ask that people write out a few sentences on what the argument is and provide data, that I can refer to, and we look at it from there and add it. But that's where we are with that. And that's why it was created. The other reason was because I saw in every presidential bid every 4 years, they would eventually publicly ask Black males what their thoughts were on politics, the state of the Black community, whatever it may be. And what I noticed was Black males would talk about policies that may be in the best interest of the Black community. Black women, I should say Black men would respond with what's in the best interest of the Black community. Black women would respond with what's in the interest of Black women. So they would talk about very specific things that Black women need. And we saw this with Ice Cube and the cocktails and queens. When the whole question came up, they were really concerned about how it benefited Black women. Well, I think Black women have socialized themselves in many ways along those lines ever since. So to this day, when questions are asked about the Black community, watch how many Black women will shift the conversation to only really talk about what benefits Black women and girls. And politically, that's the kind of thing I started to notice. And I started to kind of informally interview Black men and just ask questions. And I noticed very few had actually ever thought about what would benefit them as a demographic. We think in terms of community. We don't think in terms of ourselves. And I'm not suggesting we stop thinking about children and wives and all of that. But I do think it's become unhealthy to a certain degree when we cannot talk intelligently about what we need from policy. I mean, if we're paying taxes into it, if our efforts and labor are going into it, then you should see a return that speaks to your particular interests. And I noticed most Black men can't do that. Now, as we've started to develop and use the Black male political agenda, I've started to notice some other things. I get a lot of Black men who realize that they had never thought about their own political interests, and they find it illuminating. And then I get a lot of feminists that will say, well, the Black community doesn't need this because whatever's beneficial for Black folk is just what's beneficial for everybody. And, so they'll say, well, this isn't even necessary. We all agree in the Black community on what we need. And I'll tell the men, if that's true, sit down and have a conversation with the women in your family and go through the black male political agenda and see how far you get. I have not had one black male that's managed to get out of the first point in the black male political agenda without a serious argument jumping off, going as far as that's concerned. So black men and women do not always have the same political interests. And we know how to advocate for black women. We do not know how to advocate for black men. And many black men will actually not advocate for themselves just to keep women happy. But if we're going to have a balanced community, we got to be able to talk about what we need. And sometimes those things don't align. And I'm going
to interject. And you even see this in dating dynamics. Everyone has seen the show Pop the Balloon. And you can see how the sisters, if they don't like the brother, they have no problem reading them the riot act. But if a brother doesn't like a sister or doesn't have an interest, he struggles to be able to communicate to her what he doesn't like.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're right. So, I mean, we even see that there, so being socialized to not know how to advocate for oneself.
Oh, man, I had a feminist once tell me, you can't laugh at a black woman. Now, that sounds, like it doesn't sound like much, in the midst of this conversation. But when you think about what that means, we grew up together in the black community, sisters, aunties, mamas, grandmamas. You mean to tell me that I can't laugh at the women in my own community? I can't laugh. We laugh at the men. We laugh at elders. We laugh at children. We laugh at poor people and rich people. But somehow you're exempt from even being laughed at. You're exempt from being critiqued. The only thing you're allowed to be is pedestalized.
Yeah.
Pedestalized and worship. That's the only acceptable way of interacting with you. But I grew up with you. Really? That's that's how the thought process has kind of gone. And speaking to John Smith's point, that's an interesting point about human resources. You used to be able to find the same kind of thing in black nonprofits. There's a whole nonprofit industrial complex that I know you know a lot about, Bakari, and much of it has excluded black men because we couldn't get hold of the resources. We could apply, but often it would be mainly black women that would be able to get hold of those resources to set up and maintain nonprofits. And since Trump, a lot of that has been, dramatically downplayed and diminished in terms of access to those resources.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So real quick, I see Christ as a black man says, I've commented in many FBA spaces about Cynthia G, a FBA woman advocating for the leading of black boys before birth for years, and no FBA podcaster wants to have that conversation. Well, we know what FBA is really about. But it is good. That speaks to the point of the lack of critique, right? This is someone who not only is promoting, of course, anti-black misandric rhetoric, but she's also promoting androcide, right? Yes. And she was even brought on a national platform with cocktails with queens and had a conversation. So really, but if a man would have done that, if a man was calling for femicide, right, the deletion of black girls in the womb. Yep. He would have been canceled. He would have lost any job he had, and he'd be living on the street or back at his parents' house. This is a reality. So that is a great example.
But the irony to that is, if you think about it, black men have been accused of femicide, right? You've heard feminists say, "Well, a black man is killing a black woman every 5 minutes." So you know what I mean? You'll hear these accusations that are not empirically true, but you'd be hard pressed to find a black man that has publicly advocated for the death or murder of a female of any age. And yet she can actually advance her career and her status by making a statement like that. That's so horrible. Absolutely. And nobody cares. Except,
but I would argue that it's analogous to big game hunting. Okay. If you want to move forward in your career, show us that you're willing to take down a black man.
Yeah, and we've seen them advance, especially in the academy of all places.
Absolutely.
Well, we've definitely seen them advance at the expense of black men. But at the end of the day, I think it's kind of like what BGS talks about when he talks about the tar baby. What ends up happening is when you make these kinds of misandrous statements, and women will get up and applaud you, and the comment section will always, anytime a woman does something, crazy or whatever. Go into the comment section, you'll see scores of women defending her, So if a man beats a woman, he needs to go get the chair. He needs to be in prison. If a woman beats a man, well, what did he do to her? And he probably did this. He probably did that to her. And that's why
Right.
you'll see this kind of logic played out. And it's getting to such a point. And this is where I go with the tar baby that BGS talks about. You keep seeing that one-sided dynamic that women are pushing. And more people are saying, well, I want to know more about what these men over here are talking about, because I've heard this, and that's so egregious. You're talking about deleting black male babies. I want to hear what these brothers over here are talking about in response to that. Yeah, so in other words, the more egregious their behavior is, the more it attracts people to wanting to hear what brothers are actually talking about. And it only expands the thing they hate. So whether it's black male studies, whether it's the black manosphere, and those two things are not the same, just to be clear.
Right.
They are in response to the same environment that we as black men are living in. But regardless of that, you have a lot of people that don't want to see black male studies or the black manosphere or any of that advance. But the reason the numbers keep growing is because in response to the misandry that young and old men are experiencing, the only place they can go to get these questions answered is to conversations that men are having with each other and not mainstream society. So every time they do something like this, it really just expands the number of men in particular and women. I have a lot of women that reach out to me and thank me for my work, but I tell you this, it's not out of nowhere. They're usually mothers of sons. They're mothers of sons who have tried to secure help, resources, whatever, for their own sons and found it difficult. In other words, they found, like, when they had a girl and a boy, anything from summer programs to organizations, anything for their children, they found things for girls far easily than they were able to find things for boys, right? And so those are the women that kind of come and ask me questions and listen to my shows, and it usually takes that. Other times it'll be women who've been raised by a strong man, you know what I mean? But it's usually those kind of women that are willing to listen to what men are talking about. But all I'm saying is all of this negativity about men is only going to expand, the spaces that we're having these conversations.
What is flat blackness?
I talk about flat blackness as an addendum to what Antonio Moore and Yvette Carnell of ADOS talked about. Actually, I heard it from Yvette, so I should name her first. I heard it from Yvette first. But anyway, they talk about flat blackness in the ADOS context, right? Where there are instances where the lineage of different groups of black folk are just flattened, and we talk about blackness as one central thing, and that can be problematic in certain contexts. But I talk about it as a part two. You know, if you look up a definition in the dictionary, it'll have multiple definitions, 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Right.
Well, I add on to that by suggesting that there is a form of flat blackness where men's experiences can be flattened into black folk when convenient, right? So I think I talked about earlier, what was I saying about, what I said, it'll come back later. But okay, when I first remember hearing about BLM, BLM would talk about the death rates in regard to police homicide of black people, right? But they wouldn't qualify for what percentage of those deaths were male and female. So they would talk about the rates of police homicide, and then they would talk about the mothers who are frustrated about the loss of their children's lives. And then, and so you'd see this very interesting kind of conversation that's very manicured and very specific to maintaining some sense of balance, right? So the use of black people dying at the hands of cops is an example of that. That's flat blackness in the gendered context that I talk about. When in actuality, we know those are overwhelmingly black males. But we don't do the opposite. So if we're going to have a conversation about, say, breast cancer, we're not going to, nobody's going to say, this applies to black men and women, even though it does. Black men do get breast cancer, right? But when the concept of breast cancer and of course, all of the negativity that goes on with that, when that comes up, I've yet to see a feminist qualify that discussion for both genders and talk about black people's experiences with breast cancer. They talk about it as an exclusively black female experience. So it's kind of a one-sided dynamic. When the numbers for black men's deaths or unemployment or whatever it may be benefit the conversation, it's used as Black. But when it's specific to women to advance women's interests, they get specific about Black women. Rarely do you hear them get specific about anything relating to Black males. So that's how I use the concept of flat Blackness.
What is the Black Gynocracy? How does it differ from a Black matriarchy?
Well, when I first started to look into it, one of the things I noticed is that, a matriarchy, just very simply put, is fixated on the role of the mother, right? The mother being the central component of the family, the decision maker. And usually when you get into a larger political context, she's at the core of that. A gynocracy is different in the sense that it privileges females more so than just the mother as the central component of analysis. So that's the starting point for the gynocracy. But I do want to be clear, the two are not the same. The gynocracy is not a naturally forming institution, right? Social institution. It's not, especially when you talk about the Black Gynocracy in Jamaica and in America, and most particularly in North America, right, where you have the longest run of it. It is subsidized by the state. It's in that respect, it's primarily women that have been able to walk away with the benefits of it. And I think in many ways it was designed to disrupt the Black community, because even though we can have conversations about the gynocracy going back to slavery, I observe right around the civil rights movement is where you see one of the largest expansions of attention and resources going to the gynocracy, particularly where white feminists seduce Black feminists to leave the civil rights movement and place their emphasis on their gender and on the politics of being a woman. When you see that transaction take place, we see one of the largest expansions of the gynocracy. We're talking about is an institution that cannot exist without white subsidization, and is rooted on a very superficial idea of advancing women at the expense of men. But just like an NGO in a poor country, the benefits may not be extreme, but if you're dealing with relatively poor people, no inheritance, for example, even the smallest of resources can have a dramatic effect on social dynamics in a given community. You know
Absolutely.
what I mean?
And that's something that NGOs do in developing nations. They go in, provide support and care for women and children, and the man is considered obsolete.
Yes. And it could be a bag of groceries. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be a multi-billion dollar.
And over time, she's gonna start looking at you like, we don't need you.
Yes. Because even in the dating market, individual men are competing with not just women, they're competing with women's network. So as I said earlier, when I was talking about the welfare example, she may be getting all these resources from the state that you have to get it out the mud yourself as a man, right? You have to match the 60,000 that she might be getting in resources. You got to match it with a strong 60,000 cold. There are no benefits. There are no resources. Nobody's sending you anything. So that's already happening. But when you really start to look at what, the gynocracy and how it functions, much like I mentioned with NGOs, it's the same kind of thing. And if you're dealing with women who've been socialized to compete with their men, because that needs to be stated, right? That's a separate thing you don't see in other groups. You're competing not only with her, but you're competing with the network of resources that she's been able to amass that you had to go get out the mud by yourself. And she will tell you, if you don't have the same or more of what I have, you're not worth my time. But there's no conversation about how she got it and how you had to get yours differently. And God forbid you lose your job. God forbid the primary way that you manage to secure economic stability goes away or whatever, goes through a season of difficulty. You'd be hard pressed to find the kind of women that will stick through it with you for long periods of time, because the fundamental idea is that this is just something that you're supposed to have together, but we don't talk about those resources. So going back to the gynocracy, we're talking about an institution that has been subsidized from outside. Now, again, Trump begins to withdraw all of these resources, right? He begins to dismantle it. Over the last 2 odd years, we've been seeing it happen. The number of women losing jobs, the number of resources going to nonprofits, the welfare. I mean, what have we been hearing lately about SNAP? These resources are being diminished. And now all of a sudden you got an influx of Black women that want to have conversations about relationships and marriage again, especially as it relates in financing women.
Now it's back to, hey, big head.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
so now all of a sudden you big head again.
Yeah. I'm seeing
right?
women
So,
talking about how they're in support of 50-50 relationships again. But a year and a half ago, if you wanted a 50-50
if you come at
relationship,
me with that,
you're not a
you
man.
could lose. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But now you and
Yeah, if
BGS
you want to
talks
be
about this.
roommates, you're really a woman. You know,
Yes.
it's giving sassy. A sass queen is
Sassy,
giving girl.
which is
Yeah,
code for gay.
right.
You're not a man, whatever. And as BGS talks about, you got women that are living in extended stay motels now. You know what I mean? Doing DoorDash, driving a car they can't really afford anymore. So now the conversations are changing. We want relationships. We want marriage. Why won't men approach us? Why aren't men going to dating events anymore? You're hearing more and more of women's angst about dating and mating because the resources they used to get are drying up. And what we noticed is that when women get those resources, they don't want to have anything to do with men. But when they're not getting those resources, all of a sudden men have value again. And that's one of the things we're starting to see more and more of. And I'll tell you this, if we get a Democratic president, or I should say, if we don't get one and this continues, that kind of thing is only going to intensify. If we get one that isn't able to restore the resources that Black women have grown accustomed to, and it's highly unlikely because the money isn't there anymore, it's still going to grow in that context. So it really doesn't matter which president, which party gets into office. If they're not going to be able to get the resources they were accustomed to, the resources they saw their grandmothers and mothers have, we're gonna see a greater and greater push for relationships. The only problem with that, because that doesn't sound bad on the surface, right? But the problem with that is men are starting to discover that it's not rooted in any kind of desire to connect. It's not rooted in a desire to love. It's rooted in a need for resources. And the first opportunity that women can have those resources without men, you get the strong feeling they're going to take it and leave you sitting there. So men are starting to really pull back because we're finally seeing women with the mask off. Because it was just a year or two ago that, women were talking about, if you don't make 6 to 7 figures, you're not worth my time. But she makes $30,000 and goes to a community college with 3 kids. But I got to make $300,000 to be worthy of dating you. So social media has kind of revealed, the uglier side of women, and all human beings have a beautiful and ugly side. We can talk about it like that, but we're seeing the negative side, of women in a way that we've never seen before. Blatant, naked, and just in many ways disgusting. And so men are starting to realize that if that is how you perceive me, then maybe I should take my resources where I'm going to get the most from them. I'm gonna take them where I am honored to the greatest degree, where I'm valued to the greatest degree, and not objectified as a piece of paper, right? So we can talk about objectification, whether we're talking about sexual objectification or financial objectification. There are all kinds of conversations that we as a community and a country don't have about men's experiences with justification. And I remember getting in a debate with a feminist about this some years ago, where she said men don't know anything about objectification. We were talking about sex. And she said, men don't know anything about sexual objectification. I was like, you ever heard of the slave auction block? Black men have been experiencing sexual objectification for centuries. This is not new. And we still do, right? The expectation that Black men have over 9 to 12 inches, right? That's a form of sexual objectification.
Yes, it is.
But moving into financial objectification, nobody is getting in relationships with women in any large numbers expecting them to provide and protect. That is an expectation of men across the board. And in the Black community, it's a set expectation. So I call it selective traditionalism, right? Women want traditional resources from men, but will not reciprocate with traditional resources. She's not going to take care of you domestically. She's not going to take care of the house. She's not going to cook. She's not going to clean. But you still have to have a 1950s framework in terms of paying her bills and protecting her if there's any physical threat or otherwise. And don't get me started on providing emotional labor, which is another form of protection. But all the traditional ideas of what you're supposed to do are there, whereas she has women have no formal resources that they're required to give men in relationships. And if you don't believe me, go through a divorce and try to point out in court all the things that you wanted a woman to do and you expected her to do. You discussed it, you agreed upon it, you got married. Now see if you can hold her accountable in a court of law for all the things you talked about. So what judge is going to force her to have regular sex with you? What judge is going to force her to be nice to you, to be affectionate with you, to take care of the chores that she's agreed to take care of? Well, none of that is something you're going to be able to enforce with any institution. But the things she wants from you, you better believe will be enforced in court. So that kind of one-sided dynamic continues to problematize all of this. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And so, Mr. Sandman, shout out to the 215, the Illidale's in the building. He says, are Black women smarter than Black men, and that's why it's so easy to exploit us, or are they getting help exploiting us? I know tomorrow, I know Boots Ennis going to hold it down. He's the Broad Street Bully when he fights Xander Zayas for the, of course, unified junior middleweight championship of the world. So can you answer this question, Dr. Johnson? Are Black women smarter, or are they getting help exploiting Black men?
It's never been about intelligence. It's always been about support that has been uniquely extended to women that men don't get. But I will say I have heard in my lifetime grown women, mothers of children, who will talk about girls being naturally smarter than boys, boys being less capable. They bought into this idea, which really comes from an old racist idea that extends from the savagery notion when it comes to Black men and men of African descent. The idea is we're less intelligent, right? Going back to the continent of Africa, where we have less capacity for high levels of intelligence. You've actually seen Black feminists absorb that racist conversation and apply it within the community and make arguments for why Black women are smarter than Black men. But
Bell Hooks is a great example of that. Her literature is a great example of that.
Well, on one level, you have that conversation, and then on another level, it seems to be proved when you look at who graduates with the most degrees, who's able to get white collar jobs and so on and so forth. But what that does is it eliminates the conversation about how males are uniquely targeted. Black males are uniquely targeted in ways that Black females aren't, even as young as K through 12. And you're talking about environments that are primarily female. Especially K through 6, over 90% of the teachers are female. So is it really surprising to see girls advancing faster when there are studies that show that when boys have male teachers, they actually are able to excel faster? But we're in an environment where the genders are lopsided in many of these institutions. So we see girls advancing, and the society has opened its doors. And the evidence of society opening its doors to women in a different way than men is watching Trump withdraw those resources and those practices where women would get carte blanche access to choices. The more he withdraws them, the more you see how biased this has been, right?
Right.
So those are the kind of things that we look at. But it's never been a matter of Black women being more intelligent than Black men. No, they just had a past that we didn't have. And that's allowed them to get patted on the head in a way that Black men haven't been able to do.
And some of it is socialization. We've all seen this. Dr. Jawan Kunjufu, who of course transitioned last year.
Yes.
He mentioned this in his book. He mentioned this 40 years ago, that in some households, the Black single mother raises her daughter and loves her son. The daughter's held accountable. She's pushed intellectually and academically. She goes to Penn State. The son goes to the state pen. They never did homework. He out playing basketball all day. So some of this even takes place in the home. And of course, no, Dr. Johnson, you call this institutional, of course, an intra-communal anti-Black misandry.
Yes, absolutely. It's happening within the community, and it's involving institutions, many of which we don't control. But even as you're pointing out, the institutions we do control, like the church, other things, you're seeing this kind of emphasis on girls. And and we know this in the church because the majority of the population are female. So when you look at the leadership of the church, although you may have men in leadership, who are they catering to?
Yes, absolutely.
If you don't keep your congregation by catering to them, they will leave. So what you notice is even the church, and this is why so many men left the church, Black men in particular, but that's a whole nother conversation. But no, your point stands, man. The institutions we have been slanted in that fashion. Now, there are many Black men who have succeeded and done well, depending on how you define that. They've reached the middle class, even in terms of the lower middle class, but they've managed to do it. But here's the thing I say about that. They did it in spite of a lack of support. You know what I mean? We had no safety nets. I
Right.
bet you I could go through right now and ask you about every achievement you've ever had since elementary school, and I wouldn't be surprised at how many of those achievements you had to do on your own with no kind of stated support. No organization that said we're going to advance Black boys and men, and we're gonna help Bakari get into school. We're going to provide him a check so he can take care of his kids. We're going to do all these things so that he can focus on the future and not be stressed to the gills about what's going on. I've spoken to you and I've listened to you explain to me the sacrifices you've had to make to take care of self, to take care of family with no support. No support. No office calling you saying come work over here. None of that. You had to do it. You had what did we say? You had to get it out the mud by yourself.
Had to get it out the mud.
Now,
in fact, I can recall when I initially began my academic journey. I started off at a community college. There was scholarships set up for single mothers.
There you go. There you go.
There weren't any scholarships set up for fathers.
Now, I'm not going to put Bakari's business out there, but I will say this. This brother has called me from work and told me about the kind of work he was doing to make sure there was food on the table. And when I tell you he had no support, I can identify because I've had those experiences. Many of the brothers in the comment section can tell you stories for days about how if they didn't get off their asses and make it happen, nobody was calling them to kick down their door and provide them anything. You weren't getting a check because you had a child once a month. You weren't getting a check because you needed a check. Nobody was giving you food stamps or food just because you were hungry. Black men have had to live with their feet on the ground. What we're noticing in the last couple of years, again, going back to Trump, is a lot of women's feet are starting to touch the ground for the first time in a very long time in terms of living the way Black men live. They're experiencing Black male life for the first time, and they are not liking it at all. But this is how Black men have had to live since the beginning. And it's what we've had, what we continue to do. No, I mean, for the most part, Black men do not expect help. They don't expect a safety net. And every Black man I've run across can tell you the 6 degrees of separation between his current situation and sleeping under a goddamn bridge.
Very true.
Yeah, I mean, it is the reality of what it is.
Well, this brings me to my next question. When we talk about the Black Gynocracy, what role do Black boys and men have in a Black Gynocracy?
Servant. You serve. That's your focus. And there's so many different levels to service. I mean, especially in the 80s when I was coming up, if you listen to the R&B music, the service was sexual and it was emotional attention. When it became about finances and you needed to earn 6 figures to earn her attention, the service became about finances and making sure that even if she made 6 figures or more, you still paid all her bills, right? And what's the phrase? And I've heard women say this to me directly. Your money is our money. My money is my money, right? What that is service. Or it could be in the form of being a protector, what I call an unpaid bodyguard, right? You are expected to physically protect her, and not just your woman. It's reached a point where women in general expect men in general to protect them, and they use arguments. Well, it's larger. It's on a larger scale, right? Where women in mass kind of consider men in mass, needing to protect them, and somehow this idea is associated with traditionalism. But what I explain in the traditional idea, a man protects his wife or his mother. People who are directly tied. What feminists have tried to do is get men in the aggregate to protect women in the aggregate, right? So you might have to sacrifice your life to protect a stranger, a woman who's going through something, and your family suffers after your passing. But the idea is because you're a man and you're strong, so on and so forth, you're supposed to do it. So I remember going to a conference in Florida over about a decade ago, and I remember I was getting on a bus from the hotel. And there was a woman that I'd seen in the hotel. So we'd seen each other. I didn't know her. I never talked to her. But we at least knew we were in the same hotel. Well, we get on the bus, and a homeless man gets on the bus, and he's drunk. He's erratic. He goes over there and sits next to her. He's talking to her all in his face. Who do you think she looked at to physically protect her?
Yeah, you.
She didn't even know me. But She looked directly at me. Now, this is something that really only happens one way. I don't know the last time I was physically under threat where I looked to a woman to come ask her to provide me physical protection. The point is, it's become a social expectation of men in general, when in the past it was often tied to the people we were connected to. Now, I'm not saying men wouldn't help women, but but you really didn't have a mass assumption that a man would sacrifice his life for any random woman simply because. And I think it's reached that point where women have begun to really assume that. And you notice the frustration, because as more men talk about withdrawing from providing that protection, the frustration of many women is really started to increase, right? So that being said, I'm seeing men having conversations about, if you see an act of intimate partner violence going on between a man and a woman, call the police and keep walking. That's what men are talking about, because they're seeing men who are dying in these altercations trying to protect women, and both the man and the woman who are arguing turn against him who's coming in to protect her.
Absolutely.
Right?
This is very
so
true.
In that,
I had a similar situation once. This is while I was, focusing on my PhD. I was working at a COVID quarantine site, and this Black woman starts telling me, one, she was engaged to a white guy, but she tells me the story about how a Black man raped her, she was in law school. She tells me the story. It wasn't great, but it was a simple situation in which they were talking, and he convinced her to have sex with her, and it was trash, according to her.
okay.
So I'm like, well, what do you want me to do? And she said, well, like you could like at least go hit him or something. And I said, well, let's really talk about this. I just say I go hit him. Let's just say he doesn't want to get hit, and it's a physical altercation, and he falls and hits his head on the cement, and it's manslaughter. I said, are you going to post my bond? You going to pay for me to have a lawyer? If I don't get out of jail, I said, are you going to come and see me on visiting day and show me your titties? I said, these are real questions. Right. And I said, here's the thing I'm really missing. Why don't you have your white, if you really feel this way, why don't you have your white male fiance handle this? Why are you coming to me, this random Black guy that you work with? Because I'm disposable.
Right. And that's absolutely what it is. It's absolutely what it is. When you asked about what the role in a gynocracy is for Black men, you are exposable. I mean, disposable. Your lives are disposable when in service in regard to protection. Your lives are disposable in terms of even partnership. So in other words, if a woman, for example, wants to have a child, she can get with an everyday dude. And I've seen this happen 1,000 times. She'll get with a man, have a few kids, right? And divorce him quick. Even if he doesn't have money. I've seen men who are hobosexuals, which is just somebody that sleeps on couches and goes from one woman's place to the next.
Place to place. They get into relationships so they can have a place to live. Absolutely.
So they have a place to live, and they'll go from their mother's place to a girlfriend, back to their mother's, to whatever. There are men that are living that quality of life. I've seen 6-figure earning women with degrees, white collar jobs, nice cars, nice homes, get with brothers in that condition, have a couple kids, get rid of him, whether they married or not. But really, the core function of it was that she wanted a child. And that's what it came down to. So I've seen men become not only disposable, but become, objectified as a sperm resource and dismissed. See, we don't have these conversations about the various ways that men experience objectification. We only talk about it in terms of women and women's experiences with sexual objectification. But men have comparable experiences with sexual objectification, as well as a variety of different types. And you can talk about sperm disposability as a form of sexual objectification.
Absolutely.
You're used for your sperm and left. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, I just got through watching, or on my Patreon, we just got through discussing the film She Hate Me. I don't know if you've seen that with Anthony Mackie. It's a Spike Lee film. And at a certain point, to maintain his quality of life, highly paid, high status lesbians who want to have children pay him $10,000 for his sperm each. And it's a Spike Lee movie, so certain things are exaggerated for symbolic effect. But the fundamental idea is, because he's a high-profile Black male who's doing well, and women want his sperm, they're not trying to get married. They're not trying to compete for his interest. They want to pay him $10,000 for his sperm so they can have the kind of child. They're engineering. That's really what it is. they're engineering their children using his body. But my point is, this happens every day. And there's no conversation about these different types of experiences with objectification. So men experience it and don't even know that they're being objectified until you explain it to them, you know. But we've all grown up listening to countless stories about women, you know, complaining about objectification. And I'm not saying that those stories are invalid, but when those are the only stories put forth and men's experiences with it are ignored, it's a problem. And for women, it's only the women who have sons that I found that will come to me and say, you know what, I never thought about that. But not because the topic is interesting, because they have sons who are going through it and never had the vocabulary to understand it. And now they're offended by it. They're offended by it because it impacts their nest, you know, one of their family members. But prior to having a son, would that have come up? For very few, maybe. You know, but when it directly affects your family, you start to pay attention to these things. And mothers are noticing their sons are being exploited for resources, money, status, sperm, you know, protection, sex, you know, all of that. And men are starting to slowly come to understand the nature of this objectification, and they're starting to push back against it, which is causing a lot of friction in the dating and mating world.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this: you've discussed, as has Dr. Javon Clay Gilmore, Dr. Thomas J. Curry, feminism and Black feminism, intellectually disingenuous approach to Black men. Typically, they pathologize Black men. They do not provide empirical research, right? Could you highlight some of those pathological views that feminists and Black feminists have typically of Black men?
Oh man, I mean, we've been doing that a lot of the time in this discussion, but we could talk about the assumptions that Black men are nothing more than violent rapists. We can talk about the way Black men are treated as if they are the primary threat. I mean, we've heard arguments made recently that Black men are a cancer to the Black community, coming from Funky Deniva. We've heard the same things coming about a few years ago in terms of Black men being the white men of the community. We've heard these kinds of dismissive, anti-human, really. I mean, it's dehumanizing the way Black men are often talked about in the Black community. And we've heard these for years. I mean, we grew up, you and I, as Gen Xers, we grew up during this time period where that really became popular almost on a global scale. You know, by the time you start seeing movies coming out, Steven Spielberg directed movies like The Color Purple and a series of others. You know, these were movies where Black women were capitalizing off of the misandry of Black men while spreading the message to the world that we're monsters. You know, and that became not only a way to advance, Black women as a collective, but it was a way for them to advance themselves in their careers. Oprah's still around. She's still doing her thing. That's not an accident, you know. But there was a collective of women that built their careers off of, denigrating Black men, and it became a common practice, so common that we don't even discuss it as something that's happening, right? So there's a lot of different ways we could approach that subject. But yeah, it's definitely still occurring.
Talk to us about Black Leashing.
Okay, so Black Leashing and Blue Leashing are tied. So I talk about Blue Leashing a lot on my channel in terms of how women will use law enforcement, whether that be the police, whether that be a 3-letter organization, or whether that be a court. They'll use that to try and control or punish Black men, right? So I showed a video a few months ago of a woman who was angry at her grown son. And she was so angry, she called the police as he was leaving. I guess he was getting ready to leave. She called the police and said, he has a gun on him and he's been threatening me. So the police show up, guns blazing. And we know very well that could have been the end of his life right there. I mean, I do consider, women falsifying charges that may get a Black male killed as a form of attempted murder. I personally do perceive it that way. But she told the police he had a weapon, he was a threat, he was crazy, he was this and that. Turned out he didn't have a weapon on him at all. The police had him on the ground, they patted him down, and eventually, and this was all done on video, so I showed it in one of my shows, when they interviewed him, he said, no, she was just mad at me. She was mad because I didn't do something she wanted to do. So she called the police and fabricated a story, to have you all come over here, throw me in cuffs, possibly lock me up or kill me because of this, this statement that I had a gun that I've never had. Well, I consider that a form of blue leashing. Or if she's mad at you and calls the police and says you beat her. I mean, there's a colleague of mine who reached out to me a few years ago and told me a story about a friend of his who was out of prison for about a decade, doing well, had a business that he built up from scratch. He actually was making six figures. So you're talking about an ex-con that can't get a job, but built his own company from scratch and is doing really well. But one night he came home late and his wife got upset with him. So she called the police, accused him of having beat her and violated her. And as an ex-con, you can imagine how that was treated, right? Because it's not, he had already been to prison. So he ends up getting arrested behind a false accusation simply because she was mad, right? That's blue leashing, using the law enforcement, three-letter organizations or courts to impose, control, exploit, or even delete Black men, right? Black leashing is a little different. Black leashing, instead of using law enforcement, you tend to use a criminal element. So, right. If she's calling a gang member, if she's calling an ex-con that really doesn't mind getting his hands dirty and is not scared to go back to jail, you know what I mean? It's right. Bringing in people who are in the life, as it were.
A great example that would be the scene in Daddy's Little Girls.
Right? Yeah.
Where the brother, he's driving, they're like, oh, he's there at the courthouse waiting on Gabrielle Union to come out from court. And she's like, oh yeah, if you break my nail, this brother, he's going to crush you. That would be an example, of course, black leashing.
Absolutely. Or if you got a family member who's the family thug, he's been in and out of prison, he doesn't mind going to jail. And I've seen this as well, where even an altercation at a fast food joint where somebody says something you didn't like, and you call that cousin in and have him bring his gun to the establishment, ready to exact vengeance over somebody that upset her. I've seen that happen.
Soul Food. We see that in the movie Soul Food.
There you go.
Vanessa Williams. She calls some cousins and said, listen, she thought that the brother beat up Nia Long.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And she,
and people can get hurt or killed behind that. But that's what I call black leashing. So one manipulates and controls black men using the law enforcement. The other manipulates and controls black men by using a criminal element. Both of them are designed.
And I can say this: I've experienced blue leashing where I broke up with a woman and she threatened to call the police on me. She said, "Oh, what are you going to put? I'll call 911." And I said, "That's why I don't want to be with you because you throw a temper tantrum when you don't get your way and you try to cause me substantial harm." So this is a real thing.
It's absolutely a real thing.
Yeah. Or trying to create a physical altercation with you in a public space.
Yes.
Yeah, these are things that happen as well. Yeah,
absolutely, and it's not to say. I mean, this has been happening for decades, for years, for generations, really. But as a matter of fact, I even have some shorts. I think I have one short where you can see it happening it's in black and white because it's like in the 50s or something. But you can see a woman threatening a man by saying she's going to call the police if he doesn't start to act the way she wants him to. This has been going on for the longest. And it's not that black men aren't used to it, but sometimes when you name something and you explain it, it becomes far easier to interpret and therefore begin to do something about once it's named. So when I started talking about blue leashing and black leashing, I was shocked at the number of black men who not only had ready stories about their experiences with both, but now begin to think about how they didn't want to be used in that way. They didn't want to be exploited. So now they're breaking up with women who would even intimate that they would call the police. Whereas in the past, you just accepted that she might do it as part of the reality of being in a relationship, right? But now we're seeing black men saying, you know what? I'm not even going to put myself in the situation to where that can happen. You know what I mean? Especially if I know this is something she's capable of, whether it's through reputation or I've seen her do it, you know what? Time out. I'm good. I'm not moving that way. Well, that to me is the ultimate reward when you see men really making sense, because there's so many things we've experienced but didn't have a name for. And once we started to name it, it was like, wait a minute. Not only have I seen that happen, but it happened to my father and my grandfather. Well, I don't want to continue doing this like that anymore. You know what I mean? And
absolutely.
So that's when it starts to shift.
So I see this as a comment from Solly Walker, 1906. I think this is a great comment. Says, at Dr. C. Hasan Johnson, I recently became aware of Fannie Lou Hamer's biography. She was a real one. Shout out to Magnolia State, where she was from. And I'm curious as to why her critiques of the feminist movement are not more widely discussed among Black feminists. I have a perspective on why this isn't discussed, but of course, I'm going to yield the floor to you and the question to you.
I mean, shout out to Obsidian. You know, he used to say to ask the question is to answer it. I mean, you already know. I think in the way you frame the question, you know the answer to that. You know, and that's part of the issue, especially when you start to see feminists in the academy, right? They begin to reshape and rewrite the history of Black America from their vantage point. And so women like her were severely downplayed and often reduced to one or two moments. Sometimes you'll see that happen where, you know, when she's arguing about the need for Black representation and the power of Black voting, she might be invoked there a little bit, but nobody's going to invoke what she's talking about in regard to her criticisms of feminism, because that, you know, would present a problem. So you see that kind of happening. But there have been numerous women like that, academics, activists, all throughout history. Shout out to Tommy Curry. He writes about a lot of them. He cites a lot of them, and he's been doing that for years. So it isn't to suggest that, you know, there aren't any women that understand what we're talking about. It's more to suggest that in the popular public sphere, those women have been downplayed and dismissed to the degree that young women who are learning about what women have done historically don't get that added to their narrative.
Absolutely.
And so therefore it doesn't become an option. When I teach gender, for example, I teach about Black feminism, but I also teach about womanism. And those are two very different things.
And I teach about Africana womanism.
Well, there are a number. We could talk about Africana, we could talk about Black, and there are different aspects. They almost cover different frequencies. But the point is, they come from vastly different contexts than Black feminism, and they don't get much discussion. Much to the point where I have a colleague who's been teaching as long as I have. She's a few years older than me, in fact. And when I first started teaching womanism, I teach Black womanism, Africana womanism. When I started teaching those, she looked at my syllabus and she pulled me into the hallway and she said, "What is this?" Now, she's been teaching feminism for 20 odd years. She didn't know what womanism was. Never heard of it. So
it's a form of ideological grooming.
No, it is.
You know, and the goal is to control one's thinking and subsequently their behavior.
But I'm saying, if you're getting this from scholars who are almost 60 years old, Black women scholars who teach gender, then how do you expect younger women to even know about these ideas?
Exactly.
And so they believe the only idea that's relevant is Black feminism.
Yeah, and it's a form of intellectual erasure, intellectual and historical erasure.
Yes.
Right. When we talk about, of course, Fannie Lou Hamer, why she's not mentioned, you can say the same about Ida B. Wells Barnett. A number, of course, sisters who are part of that great line of the vine of Black radical tradition of what Pan-African revolt, because they weren't feminists or they did not articulate feminism or Black women's rights in a manner that feminists actually would support. There's a push to actually diminish them, right? Their standing, their legacy, and most importantly, of course, their work.
I did a show a couple of years ago with Clenora Hudson Weems.
Now, Queen Mother, yes.
I've been teaching her work for the longest, and I was on a show with Judge Joe Brown, and I didn't know who else was going to be on the show. I'd done that show a few times, so I go up there, and they're doing the introductions. They introduced me and Judge, and then they said, "Oh, and by the way, we have Clenora Hudson Weems," and I was like, "What?" And so we're having this conversation, and she wrote a whole book about it, but she was talking about the mother of Emmett Till, and she started going into the history of how, the way feminists represent Emmett Till. Her son was killed. She was strong, put her son's body on display to impact the movement and change the world. And what she was breaking down, and she was like, first of all, that's not what happened. It was actually a male family member who was an activist that kind of pushed her along those lines. Nothing egregious. He didn't push her in any kind of negative way, but he was trying to, he was trying to take this moment and see what could be done about it. And so he was the mastermind behind all of that. And it wasn't to take anything away from, the sister, Emmett Till's mother. It was just to say Black men are being excluded from their contributions in the name of these feminist narratives in such fashion that it's presenting an idea. And she would say over and over again, the idea of this stronger than strong woman. She said, but in actuality, as any other mother would, she took one look at her son and hit the ground. She said physically the same family member had to hold her up and then introduce the idea of putting his body on display. Now, again, I'm not taking anything away from her. Mamie Till was the shit. But, you know,
Clenora Hudson, tell the story, tell all of it, and tell the truth.
Tell the truth. And that adds to the complexity of how Black men are represented, right? But how many Black men have been removed? I mean, we could talk about oh my goodness, oh man, how am I blanking on her name, man? My memory has been getting so bad, man. I'm really starting to be concerned about certain things. But what's the sister during slavery that was is known for the underground?
Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman. Thank you. Damn it. See, I hate when I forget stuff like that, man. It's so basic, but my memory is shot. Anyway, there was a brother who not only worked with Harriet, but worked with numerous other people in terms of advancing the Underground Railroad. And he was considered, what do they call that? It's the person who drives the train. I forget the term they use. Thank you. He was considered the master conductor of the Underground Railroad. So, and I posted about him a few years ago on Facebook and in YouTube. And one of the things I noticed is I had 3 degrees in Africana Studies and nobody had ever taught me about him, right? I'd heard about Harriet Tubman since I was 5. Never heard anything about him. And it's the same kind of thing with Mamie Till. And so Clenora Hudson Weems would talk about these various men who were never credited, but had done all of this work. And she would expose the feminist plan to erase those men in the name of creating this ideal, strong Black woman that existed independent of men,
Right.
And so I applaud women like her. So that's that legacy of womanism, but you hear less and less of it today. And it's almost gotten to the point in academic settings where womanism is almost synonymous with feminism based on how it's talked about. But those old school womanists are still around, but they don't get very many mics put in their faces. You know what I mean?
This is very true.
But that was a critical difference. Moses Dixon.
Absolutely, Moses Dixon. So family, I don't know how much more time do you have, Dr. Johnson?
I don't even see my. Okay, I think we could do another 15.
Okay, so I'm gonna put the link in the chat, family. You can slide in, ask any questions that you want of myself, of course, of Dr. Hasan Johnson. As you all know, you're watching Lumumba Speaks, Black Empowerment Initiative, where we believe we can gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black, in conjunction with Bequaline Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, and of course the Omega level Black man, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, the full professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Fresno State University. So the link is in the chat, family. You can tap in, be part of the conversation. If you have any questions for us, you can go ahead and ask. But I think that is a great point you make, where we really talk about the revisionist history that Black feminists tend to engage in.
Absolutely. But there's a long legacy of that, and they don't get shouted out. So I have a series of lectures where I talk about them, but I noticed fewer and fewer, even feminists know about them. And they're still around. Clenora is still around.
Yes, she is. And if you could give me her information, I would love to interview her on my platform as well. So, because most people are surprised, but I'm familiar with, of course, Africana womanism, and I share that information with my students. Go right ahead.
No, I don't have her number. I only met her through that show, and I never got to talk to her outside of that. But I can tell you it was an honor to talk to her, and she's still as raw as she has been. But you'll find a lot of those women, a lot of those women academically are treated the way women who advocate for men are treated today online. Or what do they call them? Pick-me's?
Yes.
Many of the womanists were the original quote unquote pick-me's. A lot of them were alienated from women's spaces because they wouldn't go along the lines of the traditional Black feminist narratives. And they kind of had to suffer socially and in terms of their career advancement for the positions they took.
Right. So I see Solly Walker, you make a comment about Pan-Africanism. Definitely want you to tap in. We got a conversation about that. It's falling short of what it's supposed to have been. And of course, many people you all may not know me, kind of new to to the channel. Appreciate Dr. Johnson for allowing the introduction to his channel, to his subscribers. But there's a couple things regarding Pan-Africanism, right? My master's thesis was titled "Is Pan-Africanism Dead?" So there are a number of critiques to be made of Pan-Africanism. Many of the issues of Pan-Africanism stem from promising so much but delivering so little. But there's a reason why that's taking place, and that is, of course, due to white hegemony and concerted efforts by anti-Black racists to prevent Pan-Africanism from achieving its goals. One of the examples would be killing prominent activists and statesmen. Others would be forming coups, right, in African nations where there were Pan-African governments set up to actually benefit African people, not just in one particular country, but throughout the continent. So the latest example of that would be, of course, with Muammar Gaddafi. So definitely tap in. Hopefully we can have that conversation. But one of the issues when we talk about Pan-Africanism is Pan-Africanism, of course, began in the diaspora amongst African enslaved Africans and their descendants. But Pan-Africanism is about what? Working with Black people wherever you are in the world to better our lives socially, politically, and economically. So you could be in Greenland, right? And if there's a group of Black people there, you should organize yourselves to better our living conditions, socially, politically, and of course, economically. So irrespective of where you are, you can engage in Pan-Africanism. It doesn't have to be something that takes place on the continent. So just something to consider there. But once again, the link is in the description, links in the chat, tap in, be part of the conversation. You do not have to cam up, of course, to be part of the convo. But once again, got to be respectful. We respect diversity of thought. No epithets of any kind. This is a space of Black empowerment. Attack your argument, of course, not the person. And we look forward to hearing from you all. I think this was a great conversation. And this is something Dr. Johnson and I have talked about offline, is oftentimes it's rare that you would meet a brother who's a Pan-Africanist who has a strong, strident critique of course, Black women or Black feminism, right? And we've talked about that before. There's a couple of reasons why that tends to take place. One, there's almost individuals who typically do not have a working knowledge of history or African diaspora culture, will be under the presumption that, well, our culture is completely different than, of course, Europeans. And so if European culture is patriarchal, African culture must be what matriarchal, which isn't the case. And then oftentimes you have individuals who come into, of course, the movement who were, just to be honest, raised by their mothers. And so they really don't know how to, and Dr. Johnson, you've talked about this before, don't know how to correct or critique a woman due to not growing up seeing or being in a community with people who did that in a healthy manner or any manner at all.
Well, and I also think there's a practical level to it as well. I mean, whether you're talking about Umar Johnson or otherwise, it's very reminiscent of the Black church in that these kinds of spaces are really financed, in a certain kind of way. If you cater to women, you're going to do far better. And I think that is a significant part of the conversation. And, and so that's one of my main issues when it comes to any facet of the Black community, any group, whether you're talking about Pan-Africanists, whether you're talking about whatever group it is, if you're unwilling to call women to the carpet when necessary because you're worried about, whether or not you're going to secure finances, to me, that's a problem. You know what I mean? But that's, I think, one of the significant elements to this that becomes a problem. Not wanting to call women to the carpet. So it's because look, this thing I've even noticed on YouTube. If you want to do well as a content creator, you focus on women or white folk. Let's just be real. Now, you could do the O'Shea Duke Jackson route, and you can really develop an international audience. Right. And I think so you could do an international thing. But if you're functioning in the boundaries of North America and you want to do well as a content creator, it's tapping into white folks, tapping into women will definitely increase that. If you want to focus just on Black men, the numbers are going to be far lower. And so you have a lot of people who want to advance, and they widen their audience to do that very thing.
Absolutely. Mr. Sandman, brother LMA, still dribbling down the VA, I presume. Mr. Sandman, happy Pan-African Friday. Any questions for Dr. Johnson or myself?
Happy Pan-African Friday to you, Dr. Lumumba and Dr. Johnson. I just wanted to ask a simple question. Some time ago, a wise man once told me that the most valuable asset is access to information. You mentioned earlier that that a lot of women are taking advantage of Black men because they're having access to privileges that we don't have access to. Can you give me a list of some of those access to those privileges that they have via, through the court system or through the government that black women or women in general are utilizing against us? And also, are there any loopholes that us as black men could utilize via the system that we're not aware of?
Well, I don't, unfortunately, have the time to go through it, but I can promise you this: the very first chapter of my book does so in detail, and I talk about the specific types of resources that over the last half century black women have had access to that for the most part black men haven't, right? And that's by design. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it goes down to really dealing with how much of a threat black men can be. And I think that's one of the reasons those resources were denied them. And mind you, a lot of this is happening while you're seeing the advancement of the prison industrial complex. So black men, particularly during the war on drugs, are sent to prisons, and black women are invited to participate in the advancement of society. Now, mind you, this is also happening on the tails of the end of the civil rights movement. And I talk about this all the time. Regardless of what people may feel about the civil rights movement, one of the most threatening aspects of it is it as far as the world is concerned, it presented a united front in the black community we haven't seen since, right? And you're talking about across sexuality, race, class. You had the civil rights movement that presented a united front in a way we'd never seen, and they did so during an era, right, where you had advanced technology spreading video, interviews, messages across the globe. Civil rights movement inspired, black folk around the world and others, right? That had to end. It had to end quick. So one of the most important elements of ending that civil rights push was to extract the women and split the argument between race and gender in such fashion as to dismantle this movement that threatened to have a huge impact, right? So we actually saw it fall before I would argue we see how far it could have gone. My point simply is that these resources are not accidental. They're strategic, and they were designed to undermine the kind of political movements, the kind of political mobilization that we saw happening in the black community. And since the end of the Black Power era, we haven't really seen much. I mean, in the 80s, you had the push against, divestment in South Africa. Then you kind of pop up and you see, various movements around specific events. Then you get the rise of BLM in the 2010s, but you really haven't seen the kind of black political cohesiveness we used to see prior to that breakdown that takes place in the 70s, very much COINTELPRO fueled in its structure, but not an accident. So I don't argue that these things, these institutional resources available to women just happened, because, I don't know, somebody woke up one day and decided women were better. I argue that they're very strategic. And if you go through the first chapter of my book, I even outline them specifically in terms of what women got access to for the most part that men didn't and couldn't.
Right. Yes, and of course, Dr. Gilmore, real quick, Dr. Gilmore talks about that as well, that this was what he calls counter-revolutionary in nature.
Right.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, thank you for that information. And I'm starting to lean towards, leaving the struggle, so to speak. If all of the chips seem to be, weighed against me, it seems like the more that I fight, the more that I just get exploited.
Ah.
And if that's the case, is there any advice that you might could give in regards to protecting myself, against being exploited in the system?
Well, when you say you're about to leave, are you talking about you talking about leaving the country, or what do you mean?
Leaving the fight. Like, I'm not going to keep continuing to fight a losing fight if I know that, there's a virus in the system that's going to make it so that, the more that I fight, the more that I'm gonna just get exploited.
Well, I think if you look at the black male political agenda, I think it exemplifies my stance on it, because I understand the kind of exhaustion you're talking about. And that's how I'm viewing what you're saying. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like a particular type of exhaustion,
Yes, exactly.
of not wanting to be exploited. So my response to that is to to hook up with like-minded men that can understand what I'm talking about. Because look, one of the things I'm seeing right now is something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, and I haven't detected prior to this current moment. You have spaces where Black men are in conversation across, and I said this earlier, across class, color, caste, you name it, geography, occupation. I'm seeing Black men coming together and sharing resources and ideas in a way I've never seen before. And the one thing that I actually can see hardcore revolutionaries and even conservative Black men agree on is some of the experiences they're having in regard to dating, mating, marriage, and family production. So we're in a situation where Black men can at least be a resource to one another in this area. If we can't agree on anything else, we can't agree on religion, we can't agree on politics. The one thing Black men can agree on is that we're finding ourselves experiencing an onslaught that no other group is experiencing in the same way and to the same degree. And we're also seeing ourselves being objectified, used, and disposed of in social environments and in families in a way that no other group is experiencing. The least we can do is bond with other brothers who have gone through this. And we can say, I may not agree with you religiously, I may not agree with you politically, but I damn sure know what you went through in this divorce court, and you understand what my experience is better than anybody else walking. What can we begin to do, even if it's just exchange information that can be a benefit to one another in a way that nobody else is about to do? Because I say this all the time, there are no safety nets for Black men. Ain't nobody coming for us. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I can bet money you've already lived some of the things we talking about, right? You know, ain't nobody really coming. So is there a way that we can connect one another and exchange resources and at the very least begin to have conversations about where that can go beyond now? That's kind of the way I approach and navigate the exhaustion I hear you talking about, because, otherwise I'm going to be on a roof somewhere with a deer rifle, and that's the problem. So,
right.
Yeah,
real quick,
I just gotta.
hold on, real quick. Dollar Will, I need you to come up in queue just to make sure you're not trolling, and then I can bring you into the live. So I just need you to come up in queue, make sure you're not trolling, then I will bring you into the live. Okay, got you. Very good. You can turn your camera off, I will bring you in. So real quick, just in respect to time, Sandman, we're going to move forward. LMA, he's been waiting patiently, but I just want to respond very quickly to Solely Walker. So I see what you're saying about that recent episode of the 154 podcast, and the guy's take on the Black Southern accent. The guy that made that claim was the guy who played Dr. King in the movie Selma. One thing you need to know is that the individuals on the 154 podcast aren't Pan-Africanists. And this is one of the things that takes place with the critique of Pan-Africanism, is people seek to critique Pan-Africanism based on the behavior of people who aren't Pan-Africanists. That would be analogous to critiquing a Christian based on the conduct of a Muslim. Just something to consider. Okay, Brother LMA, go right ahead.
Good evening, Dr. Lumumba. Good evening, Dr. Johnson. Can you catch me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, great. Great conversation. I guess my question is, hopefully I can make it short. So I do think that, we as a community need Black male studies, but in the sense of, I guess, of current, how can I put it, the current environment in the Black community, I don't want male studies to be seen as in competition or competing for resources, with the women of the community. But my question is that I want this, I want this movement to flourish, but my fear, I guess my concern is that how does the Black male studies prevent I guess, overt misogyny or covert misogyny, men who are just they back in the day it was you would see, like, especially in the white manosphere, it would be these guys are red pill, they care only, they care about the being of men, but deep down they're just white supremacists, and this is just their angle. They're just thinly veiled white supremacists pretending to advocate for men, whereas in reality, all they care about is just white supremacy of power. And analogous to this will be, how do you prevent certain black men who are, textbook misogynists from coming into the movement and derailing the movement from a place of, we're trying to deal with men's issue, we're trying to uplift black men and as a part of a black community, uplifting the community, whereas there are just misogynist men who come in who just want to, denigrate black women. I don't know if you've seen this, but I've, been kind of observing, particularly red pill, but sometimes in the black manosphere as well, or whatever's called the black manosphere, that you'll see men who, obviously they have a thing against black women, but they're just dressing themselves up in black male advocacy. And I was wondering if Dr. Johnson had any thoughts on that. Or do you understand my question? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of it, I don't have my traditional sound setting in my earphones. A lot of it I couldn't make out as clearly as I would like to. But I think it's more for me a matter of, and I can't remember the old adage about, oh goodness, I can't remember the story where they were talking about, you have a dark wolf in you and a light wolf in you, and in terms of the positive and negative aspects of your nature. And when somebody asked, well, which one is stronger? And the answer was the one you feed. So in other words, for me, the people I support, as far as I'm concerned, have the values that I advocate for and approach the matter in a manner that I think is what resonates with me. And those are the ones I support. And that would be my answer to that. If you find somebody to be what you consider an abject misogynist, and that goes against your value system, then you should only support the ones that advocate the way you think they should advocate. Now, I would argue that I think that has, in some circles, become a way of deflecting from what men are saying and discounting what men are arguing simply because it's something that a lot of people don't want to hear. But to the extent that what you're saying is happening, my answer would be support those. And here's the other thing. If you don't find anybody that makes the argument the way you think it should be made, then that sounds like an invitation for you to speak up, to create a platform of your own. And I'm not assuming you don't have one. I just see the three letters LMA. I don't know you. You may already have, a huge platform for all I know. But I'm saying to anyone in response to your question, if you don't think that there's anybody out there that's addressing the issue along the lines that you advocate for, that to me sounds like the invitation for you to create a platform so that you provide people another option. Because at the end of the day, you have thousands of men, in the manosphere. You have numbers of men in black male studies. And again, those are two separate things. But my statement is, in all of that, men are, who are coming to the table and having these conversations represent, almost like different frequencies of the argument. Like, Bakari is going to come at it and he's going to deal with it a certain way, right? He's going to approach this issue, but he's also going to include Pan-Africanism. I don't do that as much. I come at it in my way. There are other brothers. Each brother has a different frequency on this issue. Support the ones whose frequencies align with yours and not so much the ones who don't. And if you really feel the need to call somebody out, well, that's up to you as far as that goes. But that, to me, is how you address that. And there are so many options, right? One of the things I did a couple shows about in the last week is how there's so much attention, in terms of mainstream media denigrating the manosphere. But they all keep quoting Andrew Tate and Myron Gaines. Now, both of those men are in the white manosphere. There's a black manosphere that nobody quotes from. And even if I was going to deal with Andrew Tate and Myron Gaines, they don't even quote from those two guys. Each of the articles that I run across that denigrate the manosphere say the manosphere is a misogynist space, and they listen to guys like Andrew Tate. They don't even bother to quote them, let alone the thousands of other men who are making content on a regular basis and bringing different information, arguments, and solutions to the table. They're dismissed altogether. So that's why I'm a little hesitant when I hear the argument made, well, we just, we got to deal with this misogyny. Well, if you leave it up to certain factions, everything is misogyny as far as what black men have to say. But if you find the people that argue and advocate the way that situates well with you, those are the ones you need to support and help build whatever it is you're trying to create and they're trying to create. And what you'll find over time is you'll start to see those ascend and those descend based on where the will of Black men are trying to take the argument. So I hope I answered your question, but I couldn't hear a lot of it because of the connection.
It's all good. No, okay. I guess if Dr. Bakari will allow me, just a quick follow-up question. I guess, do you fear that this movement could be derailed by those with, ill will intentions? I think about like the white manosphere. Like I said, it started off talking about just, men's right activists, and now it's derailed into a complete white nationalist. You got the FBI, basically, what I'm looking for, surveilling them. And I'm just concerned that this, any movement can be poisoned, any movement can be derailed and turn into, going to some nonsense. And I guess my fear is that, this could also happen to Black male studies or just the Black manosphere in general. And I guess my question was, is that a concern of yours? And if so, what were your thoughts on it? But I'll take the answer offline. Thanks.
Well, I guess once you look, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go right ahead, because I was going to read Christ as a Black man's statement, but go right ahead. You're absolutely, I see the statement. You're absolutely right. Black men opening our mouths is considered misogyny. It's absolutely, it's a control measure. But to the this
question,
is something I've experienced in the academy when I was in my PhD program, because I was very quickly, and we're just going to go back to, of course, a personal anecdote, but if we're talking about critical race theory, I'm counter storytelling, right? My first week in my doctoral program, the class I was taking was critical race theory. So I'm there, and I'm like, okay, I got to show up and show out. I got to show that I'm PhD material. So, I'm quoting this scholar, showing I'm well-read, well-spoken, well-versed in, of course, the literature, so on and so forth. After that first week, the professor was also my advisor. He takes me, he says, we need to meet. And he says, you said you like your constructive criticism the way you like your liquor. Straight up with no chaser. Facts. He says, I'm going to give it to you straight. He says, your intellect is intimidating the female students. And I asked him, I said, are the female students who are just as loquacious as me, are you having this conversation with them? I said, you know what, you don't even have to answer the question. So this speaks to your point that us opening our mouths is considered problematic, and particularly if you're disagreeing with a woman or even challenging a woman intellectually, it's seen as, of course, misogyny.
Right. I mean, you have people who will come out and say, well, I just hate women. And then, you have people who are labeled misogynist because they said something a woman doesn't like. Who gets to determine what it is and what it means is a conversation nobody wants to have. People are far more comfortable with dismissing Black men as misogynistic, but they don't want to get into the weeds of what may be problematic coming from the mainstream society in the first place. But I want to get to MLA's question about, movements being undermined. Am I fearful of that? Well, I think as a student of history, I don't know if I should say it that way, but every organization or movement that ever inspired me was undermined in the same fashion. And I just look at it as a feature of war. And truth be told, it's already happening. You know what I mean? It's already been going on, especially in social media. At least back in the day, if you wanted to have someone infiltrate an organization, you had to find a person, maybe threaten a person to do it. Now, online, you can create some false profiles and go from there. It's so much easier in certain respects. So I look at it more as a given. But again, as a feature in a long-standing, protracted war where Black men for centuries have been fighting for freedom in terms of how we define that differently in different eras, at the end of the day, it's just one of the features of warfare. And all you can really do is get up every day and contribute to the fight in a manner that, you can look at yourself in the mirror on. And that's really all you can do. You can connect with others who, you feel advocate the same way you do. And to the extent that you can connect with others further out than that, who you don't fully agree with, but you can at least agree on this topic or this issue, you do that as well. And that's really all you can do. as my boy BGS says, all you can do is throw your shekels into the pot, whatever contribution you can make, and we go from there. We've seen movements, given birth, and then we've seen them die, and they inspired the next movement. And and unfortunately, as a feature of warfare, being undermined, being maligned, being infiltrated, all of those things are inevitabilities to certain extents. Now, I'm sure Bakari can go in on this as well, knowing the history of, say, COINTELPRO and other types of organizations. But would I ask any of the like, if we talk about the Black Power era, would I ask any of those organizations to not have done what they've done because we knew they'd be undermined by the FBI? No. Their contribution still inspires to this day. And I'm saying that as the child of a Panther. You know what I mean? I saw how many of them were either killed, chased out of the country, or imprisoned and had the keys thrown away. Those sacrifices are still relevant, even knowing how much was done to malign what they actually stood for and what they actually did. Now, our era of that is underway as we speak. However that's going to look, it's going to have its differences from the past, its similarities, but all you can really do is make the contributions to the struggle that situate best in your spirit. And as long as you can look yourself in the eye in the mirror every day, that's about all you can really ask for. So before I leave this earth, I want to be able to say I did my best. This is what I contributed. My area of the struggle is to, help Black men actually see what's being done while mobilizing us to see what we can do to free ourselves from as many different problems and traps as possible. That's about all I can do. But I feel you, because it is frustrating to watch how often this has happened. But I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. So just make your fight best you can. Bloody the eye as best you can, and keep it pushing.
Dollar Will. You've been waiting patiently. What say you?
Well, thank you, brother. Thank you for pleased to meet you. First of all, I'll be subscribing immediately after this to your channel.
Appreciate it.
Despite my youthful voice, everybody, I'm 62 years old. I got into the Afrocentricity movement in the early 80s, like 82 to be exact, when I came out.
Wow. I wasn't even born.
So Farrakhan had just reawakened what you see as the Nation of Islam right now. Crack era was just starting. AIDS had come on the scene. And so I'm a fast track. I got a job in a major media organization. I part of why I got my emoji, because of some work I had to put in. Okay. All right. I had to get in that legal system. All right. And put that work in. So when I came there, America had already transitioned to moving from the Bakke decision. The thrust moved from affirmative action to this thing called diversity. So we're seeing the fruit of it today, which really was like displaced Black men. That's really what it was. So it was happening in real time at this world-known 3-letter media organization. And they mostly had a meeting. I had just started working there within 3 months. They had a meeting. The Black women were putting in such work. They had an all company-wide meeting of like 600 workers to discuss why are there so few Black men there. And they said there's no way that the number of gay men should outnumber heterosexual men. And the Black women were putting in that kind of work. I had just started working there, like I said, within 3 months. But just to fast forward 10, 15 years in, I'm of course getting discriminated against like what happens with us. And so I had to make an EEOC case. Those older women who were there putting in the work from the 80s, by the time, let's say 94 to 96-ish, I'm doing work. I'm leading a union movement too. So I'm doing it. All right. So the older women from the 80s, they understood it and supported it. But something happened with that next generation. We, as the youngest baby boomer and the oldest Gen X, I'm born in the cusp here of 64, Civil Rights Act 64. I'm born there. Okay. We failed. We did not pass on to the next generation that this fight is going to last beyond your life. It started before you, We're not likely going to end it in your lifetime. We're just trying to move the football to get a first down. Okay.
Right.
Touchdown for the next future generations, whenever that is.
Right.
So when I started doing my work, the younger generation of Black folks, they didn't have, they were coming at me harder than the white folks, saying, if you don't like it, you should leave. Love it or leave it. I'm like, whoa. And so the older, more seasoned Black folks, they were like, okay, he's young, he's willing to put in the work. Let's let him do it. If I needed assistance for them, they were there. But this younger wave, we didn't pass it down. So in short, what happened to us, the Black arts movement was successful. The civil rights movement was successful. The Black power movement was successful. The riots were successful in as much as they galvanized us, and it created this Black middle class that we have today. We didn't have all these Black mayors in all of these cities. All that came as a result of the success of those other movements. But what happened is my favorite scene from I'm Going to Get You Sucker, when the brother he went to see the older Black power brother, and he had this white woman there, and he was like,
I remember that.
He's like, we went down to the employment service office. We were going to take over and all that. He said, brother said, well, they was hiring that day.
They was hiring, yep.
And that's what happened to us. We lost our way and thought that the fight was just about getting a job. And I'm guilty. We're all guilty of that. And we have to now we're seeing with some of the hard structural victories we thought we won, that they're now being taken away from us. We have to know that this fight is eternal, and Black studies and Afrocentric studies, that's crucial, because we're just Negropeans, and I don't think we're gonna get where we need to go from the frame of Negropeans. And in defense of the Black manosphere, the Black manosphere is the electronic Black barbershop. That's what it is. Everybody's there, high and low. Okay, if you were around to hear when BGS had the Coliseum, we had everybody from the literally the pimp to the preacher. Okay, the frat guy, the drug dealer, everybody was there, and we had a safe battle. Basically, we had the class war. Okay, everybody argued and got it all out. And then we just came to a nice peace, understanding who we all were, and we actually moved closer together as a result of it. We don't have nothing else to say, and so we need that now. We need a Afrocentric movement again to teach us about other ways of defining family and how different various African cultures have approached it. Not to say that we need to mimic what they did. We just need to know that there are other ways of doing things. And you can study some, other cultures, because right now, just using the American culture model and the American Christian model, that doesn't really work for us. And we don't know that there are other ways. When we talk about patriarchy, the only patriarchy we know is this particular one. And I like to remind people that Africa was mostly patriarchal,
very much so.
Mostly matrilineal, but it wasn't the same exact patriarchy as the model we have, European patriarchy. So we need our scholars from Black studies and African studies to come and explain the difference between matriarchy and matrilineal, and how they were working to try to work out a power share. But once you get the uber culture of Christianity and colonizer, we lose agency, and we can get it back, but we have to be mindful of what we're up against. We have young people that are not educated in school about what culture is, what sociology is, and what it means to socialize you, where your ideas come from. We think that everybody just is like organically just a bunch of individuals, which is Eurocentric. And so we have to push this knowledge down to maybe junior high, high school level. It shouldn't be just at the college level. And so, I got a lot of guidance from my years at Howard University in the 80s. So a lot of those videos y'all see with Dr. Clark and all of them, I was in the audience in some of them videos. But anyway, thank you, brother.
No doubt.
So
Appreciate you, brother.
What can we do to get the younger generation connected to a broader understanding of culture and sociology and our ways of forming families and the like, so that we don't.
So yeah, I'm gonna answer that, and I'm gonna look to try to tie this into the conversation that we're having with Dr. T. Hasan Johnson this afternoon. Very quickly, family, if you're watching, make sure you like, subscribe, share, donate. Right, you're watching LumumbaSpeaks.com in conjunction with Equaline Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire. So I would say this is someone who really has a background in youth development. There's a couple of things, right? One, you can actually have programs and initiatives that address the needs of young people, right? One of the things I'll talk about as a Pan-Africanist and being a functional Pan-Africanist is doing work that addresses the needs of the community, right? I'm not a Christian, never will be. I'm an atheist, but I grew up in a Christian background. One of the things that Jesus is said to have taught the disciples in the book of Matthew was this practice of treating people's needs as holy. Right, so we see that there are particular needs for young men. One would be, of course, this concept of rites of passage. How do I become a functional man in civil society? Another would be, how do I develop the skill set to be able to make a living and care for myself, a livelihood. So if we address those issues, and then you do so in a manner that's relevant, right, in which you're speaking to. You speak the vernacular, so there's a cultural connection. You tend to have, them really, gravitating towards you. My experience is that if you are a masculine man that they can identify with, and I'm quite sure, Dr. Johnson, you can speak to this, young men will gravitate to you, right? They're looking for that type of energy. I can recall when I was living in Columbus, and there was an older brother at the gym who was a retired Marine. He was about 66, 67, and still jacked. All of the brothers in the gym who we would consider guys who could lift some real weight, we all gravitated to that older brother. And before you know it, there was a mentor-mentee relationship. We were talking to him about issues we were having in relationships, how we should, discipline our children in a manner that doesn't cause harm, but helps them learn the lesson. And so this is something that takes place. So I would say, one, whatever you're doing, make sure that it's relevant, it addresses their needs, and make sure that there's a cultural connection.
Well, I am at a point where I have to go, but I want to say this, and I appreciate Dollar Will. I've seen him, in these spaces for a minute, but I've never had a chance to hear him directly. So peace to you, man. I appreciate hearing about about your life. But I guess what I would say to the whole question of reaching the youth, don't underestimate to what extent it's already happening. It took my son to tell me this years ago. I mean, I want to say back in 2019, 2020, he was like, do you have any idea how many 13-year-olds are listening to you, Pop? And I was like, well, I'm picturing men like us, our age and up. And I'm finding out more and more that you got a lot of people, thanks to the internet, who have been tapping in. I'm seeing monks who are 12, 13 years old, who aren't even trying to get into the issues that we've been talking about. And it's not just because of the manosphere or whatever else. It's also because of what they've grown up seeing. So the solutions they're hearing about online are coming out of frustrations that they've already bared witness to. But my point is, there are a lot of them that are already listening. And so really all it is just, to me, taking into account when we have these discussions, how many different people are listening who are in completely different contexts. This is one of the reasons that you hear me. I mean, I use a certain amount of jargon, academic jargon, but I try to tamp that down as much as possible because I don't want to alienate my audience. I don't care if they're 13 years old or 85. I don't care if they got a high school diploma, never finished school at all, or they got a doctorate. I try to leave it as open as possible because Black men are coming to the table from so many different situations. I want to leave it open as widely as possible for us to have dialogues. This is why I don't really try to delve into a whole lot of topics that typically divide Black men, because I'm trying to be a resource that brings Black men together. So I'm not going to join an argument that's long-standing, you know, like we're gonna continue this debate against Christianity versus Islam. I'm not doing that because I know where those arguments go. I'm trying to have a discussion that brings Black men together so we can actually build from there. So, but as far as the youth, man, I think it's already happening. I think we could definitely focus on it to a greater extent, but don't underestimate how many of them are already listening. And I really do need to go, but damn it, Nameless Protagonist popped up, so I at least want to hear what the brother has to say before I have to hop off. But I want to thank Bakari for having me up here. I really appreciate it. I want to make sure y'all check out his channel. You know, make sure you delve in, really, you know, listen to what the brother's talking to. And I just wanted to thank him before Nameless dropped what he's about to drop.
And I appreciate you, Dr. Johnson. I'm one of the few Pan-Africanists that doesn't pander to women. So if you want a Pan-African perspective where it's actually going to be rooted in Black masculinism and a Black man, this is where you want to come. So I just put that out there. But Nameless Protagonist, you will, of course, finish the conversation. So please unmute yourself and share with us what you have to say.
Firstly, to the instructors on the panel in the chat. What's
up, What's? How you been, man?
Fam, I've been in the mountains training. Bro, I got some data you guys are gonna love, and in the near future, maybe you'll catch me on panels, and I may start doing some work on my channel again. But there are a lot of bits of information I want to swing by you guys because you are adjacent to where a lot of these discussions are happening.
Okay.
I want to draw.
You have my contact information?
I think I've got your email. If not, you can drop it in the back chat. If you're comfortable with that, and I can definitely hit you back up later.
Cool.
I've fleshed out political Mandalorianism and all of that. I think you'll like it. So, and a large reason why I wanted to present that, because there's a few historical events you guys can take a look at and go into greater detail with, because they rhyme with what has happened to this moment. Starting with the 15th Amendment, when Black men got the right to vote. And I want to draw attention to what Frederick Douglass said, highlighting the fact that when Douglass highlighted in front of the United Feminist Front, who were at the time formerly abolitionists, their argument had always been educated white women should have had the right to vote before Black men. And the premise behind that was that Black men were no different than white men, with the difference being an aptitude discrepancy. So their idea is that if you don't accept the white dude, then why would you take on a Black male who was nothing more than a quote watered down version of the same thing? So when Douglass was making his case in front of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, he said that unless and until women, because they are women, are targeted, killed, dragged out of their homes, hung from lampposts, brains dashed all over the place, he went into detail, because they're women, then they will probably have the opportunity to make an argument for having the ballot. But for the Black man, it's a case for survival, not preference. It's not an argument to divide up the spoils of empire. It's to simply survive. And I want to reiterate this point, because when you take a look at every single argument that's formulated against Black men, this idea of wanting to be centered that rears its head later, these separate movements from, what was her name? Ida B. Wells, that ain't I a woman argument, all of that started.
About Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth, right. That whole argument of wanting to get included into being recognized as the same way that the educated white female was, who, by the way, 9 times out of 10 migrated here from Europe, wasn't even really in the South like that. Their whole argument was it should have been then over us because we are made as a parallel to these white dudes. So when the hijacking of Title VII that happens, when Howard Smith forcefully interjects sex into the classification of protected class, you actually get a pseudo class modality that's put in place where fundamentally it places Black men at the bottom because the double dip metric was inherently put in place of female and Black, later emphasized by the Combahee River Collective, where there's this idea of needing Black women centered, even though the whole context of Black women not being put in front is because they were in a protected posture, which again, that rhetoric gets exposed during the whole Ice Cube moment, where when he did his platinum plan, the question was, aren't you Black people? And they said, no, we're Black females.
Yep.
That's where all of this starts to come into play. That's why we brought to the surface the fact that there is a separate political inertia that's always been there from the very beginning, that at its core started with the Freedmen conversation and extended into Reconstruction when the 15th Amendment was put there and Black men got the opportunity to vote before white women did.
Okay. I don't know. Bakari, okay. Make sure you're still there. I gotta go.
Okay, no problem. No problem.
All right. Shout out to you. Shout out to Nameless. I'll holler at y'all later, man.
Have a good night, fam.
Nameless protagonist, we need to connect. I've put my email in the private chat. We need to connect because you're cooking with fish grease, right? Oftentimes, the presumption is, as a Pan-Africanist, for some reason, people think that I'm going to be pro-feminist. I tell people I vehemently abhor feminism, and I go into, of course, the anti-Black misandric views of feminism. I even have touched on some of the things that you talked about, and then the argument is, well, you're being divisive. No, I'm being historically accurate and intellectually honest, right? And if we're going to have a real conversation about how we move forward as a people, we have to address these type of ideological constructs that dehumanize the Black man and see us as less than human. And would you agree with that?
I think it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton that said, if the loaf of suffrage is to be shared amongst everyone, let it be amongst the educated white female, not the Sambo, not the Patrick, not the whatever else she was going into, man. Like they made it very clear. That's been the modus operandi of this country since day one. And there are a lot of moving parts to that, but I just wanted to highlight that point because even when we get into what's understood as Pan-Africanism now, we've got the Martin Delaney spirit that was there, which posited the question of, should we be doing for ourselves with what we have from an industrial perspective? Or do we get into this argument of being included into something that never wrote us in the formula in the first place, nor did it even see us as human? Right. And I think we're suffering the consequences of the rhetoric and the narrative that ended up winning in the end for whatever reason that it did.
Yeah, I absolutely. I would agree with you 100%. And most people are unfamiliar with Martin Delaney, who, of course, was considered the father of Black nationalism, right? He's the one who coined the term Africa for the African. And of course, he worked with Frederick Douglass on their North Star newspaper. And of course, they had some disagreements due to. So what are your thoughts on Nature Boy? So I'm not really familiar with Nature Boy. What I do know is that he was in Georgia, I believe the Atlanta area. From what I read, he was operating a cult and he was preying on members of that community sexually. He was essaying people. That's all that I know. But I will say, and of course, I would even would love to hear from, of course, nameless protagonists about this, is there are a lot of individuals who will posit themselves as pro-Black, right? Another example would be Butter Polite, right? There are a number of individuals who would come in and they have the charisma, the rhetoric, and they use it as a way to really bring down people's defenses and then, of course, abuse them in whatever way they seek to do. So this is something that takes place irrespective of someone is claiming that they're pro-Black, if they're Christian, Muslim, etc. Is unfortunately that we have people in our community who are predators. But that I don't know much about him other than the fact that I know he's in prison.
Yeah, all I can say.
Go right ahead.
As it relates to that, I think the autopsy is very clear when you take a look at the way people like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was taken when she passed on in transition. the way Dr. Marimba Aini to this day is misunderstood and demonized, how if you take a look at Dr. Shahrazad Ali, coming from the old school Noble Drew Ali sort of lineage of thought, there are threads that have always posited this. And, you know, this is leading to a bigger conversation. I'm slightly digressing of the role that the Frankfurt School played and Marxism as it relates to how specific concepts like the F list and this idea of fascism played a asymmetrical role in decontextualizing the conversation of Black men as they relate to family, because masculine centered, masculine oriented building blocks were seen as a problem in that school of thought, which has matriculated to the political thought, which most people have just taken as face value as progress. They don't know where these ideas come from. People need to make a closer look at the Frankfurt School and its intentional role.
Well, actually, if I could interject, I wrote an article and it's published in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. If you Google it, you can find it titled "Why I'm Critical of Critical Theory," and I go in on the Frankfurt School. Right. So
it's some specific writers there. Yeah. So you already know. Yeah, there's some specific writers that contributed to that. And I guess the point I'm highlighting is that many people have taken those ideas as just the baseline face value software for how they edit and interpret reality, kind of like their internet browser for the real world. They view reality through these lenses and these ideas and don't even understand where they came from. They're just passed on through momentum, or I don't want to say epigenetic, but it's kind of like a oral tradition and the political education to adopt it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very, very quickly, Crisis of Black Man. You said I grew up near 125th Street in New York. Conscious Brothers were derailment to productive Black men. Of course, I've been to Harlem. I stayed in Harlem for a summer, 146 in St. Nick. Fast away to Harlem is an A-train slick. Talk to me about what the brothers were doing that called themselves conscious and how it was a derailment to productive Black men. Because, of course, the conversation we're having right now is centering Black men, our values, our wants, values, and needs. So how is it that what they were doing was a derailment to productive Black men? I definitely would want to hear that. And I see Brother Christopher, you say he wasn't pro-Black. I would presume you're speaking to, of course, Brother Polite, but he was one of those individuals that was talking about Black woman as God. And this is just a lot of pandering that takes place. Same thing takes place in the church, where you tell Black women what they want to hear, and as a result, you're able to benefit financially. So we know this is something that is very common.
Yeah, that's whole side note.
In fact, this is why I had a falling out with Dr. Umar Johnson, Umar Ifantunde, the Ifantunde Queendom, as he calls himself, right? We used to, have a colloquy online, or at least particularly on the phone, on a regular basis, call, text, etc. And then when I kind of went in, and, his behavior, his antics, unprofessional behavior. Of course, after that, we just never spoke anymore. So, but we tend to find this is something that is very common, particularly amongst individuals who, in my opinion, of course, nameless, you can, of course, interject. I find, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, that individuals who are pander to women typically don't have anything tangible to offer the community. And so that's what they rely on to remain relevant and financially viable. Nameless, what would you say to that?
I think it goes back to the Frankfurt School conditioning of non-tolerance. So the shift from classic liberalism to what you see being expressed by the Frankfurt School reverse the idea that people should listen to ideas that differ to them and then adopt accordingly. The idea ends up being, if you let certain people speak, then they cause more harm in the process. And so you are supposed to openly interject, deflect, and overwhelm anything that is not identified under the context of solidarity, in quote, whatever that means, and to allow for and include anything that finds some branch, and you can use the Title VII Jenga puzzle to sort of decide, what gets attached to that as an ally. And this is where this language, this verbiage comes from, along with this behavior. The understanding is that if you adopt this pandering mentality in modality, firstly, that's where the money's at. And then number two, that's where you get your social proofing. So there's a very distinct social strategy that's baked into where they're going to be seen as human, not just men, but human. Because from that position, I think we inherently recognize that as being put in a child's place. But when juxtaposed to being exiled, many people choose that to be seen as a favorite of the mother rather than having to forge your own path and force exile, essentially, in myriad ways, which is how you get this cancel culture sort of pattern that's really been popular when the state was supporting it. It's a lot of other moving parts, but I really draw so much of this back to the Frankfurt School because I really see that's where the script was really developed at and mastered.
And Dr. Johnson talks about this concept of the echo chamber, right? How feminist thought typically is axiomatic. He argues that it's basically religion. I could say for someone who's been in the academy, this is something I've seen, witnessed, and experienced. And so it really speaks to your point that this is really an outgrowth of that. So there's a lack of criticality, a lack of accountability, right? Because like you said, then it's seen as, well, you're just going, you are fighting against solidarity, right? There's a lot we could unpack, but I want to be respectful of Dr. Johnson's platform because he left me on his platform, even though we're doing streaming on mine. So I don't want to. You said polite came out of Dr. York's community. That's a whole other discussion. I've talked about that on my platform as well. These are individuals who are predators. We even did a show a couple years back on some of the core characteristics that we find in individuals that are predatory. One thing is I've talked about, starting to work with Dr. Amos Wilson in his massive text Blueprint for Black Power, is typically individuals who posit a particular religion. Right, they're doing that so that they aren't able to be held accountable. They view themselves as being immune from questioning. So he argues that is one thing that we have to always be, of course, cognizant of and leery of. But I want to be respectful of Dr. Johnson's platform, and I don't want us to just continue to talk ad nauseum on his platform. So we are going to end now. We're going to put a pin in the conversation. But I saw there, but I think Christopher, you said you wanted to do a part 2 and a part 3. So I will reach back out to Dr. Johnson and see if that is possible. Because there are a number of issues that I think coalesce in terms of Pan-Africanism and of course, issues that Black males face. Like I said before, there tends to be an erasure of Black male leadership in these Black radical spaces. Black Lives Matter is an example of that. And I think one of the things that we can do is do a show addressing the anti-Black misandry in the Black Lives Matter movement. And where they're at today. So just respectfully, family, I respect everyone's time, but I also want to respect Dr. Johnson's platforms. But until next time, family, y'all know what to do. Make sure you always bet on Black. Peace. Before you go, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you for supporting the channel. And remember, here at Lumumba Speaks, we always bet on Black. Peace.